Good evening and welcome back to Almighty Sleep, a city built on 7 hills by a shepherd king who may never have existed. An empire that stretched from the Scottish Highlands to the sands of Mesopotamia, from the Atlas Mountains of North Africa to the shores of the Caspian Sea. Rome did not simply conquer the ancient world, it rewired it, leaving fingerprints on our laws, our languages, our calendars, our cities, and the very way we think about power. Tonight, we trace that extraordinary journey from a cluster of mud huts along the Tiber River to the most consequential civilization the Western world has ever known. Before Rome, the world the city was born into. To understand Rome, you have to understand the world that existed before it. Not because that world was peaceful or orderly, it was neither, but because Rome did not appear from nowhere. It was shaped by what surrounded it, and it spent its first centuries absorbing, stealing, adapting, and occasionally improving on everything its neighbours had already invented. That is frankly one of the most Roman things about Rome. They were magnificent borrowers. The Italian peninsula in the early first millennium before the Common Era was a patchwork of peoples, cultures, and languages. It was not a unified place in any meaningful sense. If you could stand on a hilltop somewhere in central Italy around 900 before the Common Era and look out across the landscape, you would see a world of dense forests and broad river valleys, of small farming communities clustered on defensible ridges, of smoke rising from fires in settlements that had no names yet in the historical record. In the north, the Villanovans were developing what would become Etruscan civilization. The Etruscans are one of the great mysteries of the ancient world, a people who flourished and built cities and made stunning art, and buried their dead in elaborate painted tombs, and whose language remains so imperfectly understood that scholars are still arguing about it. They were wealthy, sophisticated, and deeply influential. The Etruscans gave Rome more than it would ever comfortably admit. They gave it architectural techniques, religious practices, symbols of authority, and possibly the very concept of what a city should look like. The Romans later had complicated feelings about this debt. Imagine borrowing your neighbour's lawnmower for 20 years, and then writing a history in which you invented the lawnmower. That is approximately the relationship Rome had with the Etruscans. To the south, Greek colonists had established prosperous cities along the coasts of southern Italy and Sicily, a region so thoroughly settled by Greeks that the Romans called it Magna Graecia, Greater Greece. These were not outposts or trading posts in the modest sense. They were full cities. Cumae, the earliest Greek colony on the Italian mainland, had already been established before 700 before the Common Era. Sybaris was so wealthy and so devoted to luxury that its name became a word for indulgence in multiple languages. Syracuse in Sicily would become one of the most powerful cities in the entire Mediterranean world. These Greek cities brought with them their alphabet, their religion, their philosophy, their art, their agricultural techniques, and their very specific ideas about what civic life should look like. Rome absorbed all of it, slowly and thoroughly. Further south still, and across the narrow sea, was Carthage. Founded by Phoenician settlers from the coast of modern Lebanon, Carthage sat on a peninsula in what is now Tunisia, and by the 5th century before the Common Era, it controlled a maritime empire that dominated the western Mediterranean. Carthage was fabulously wealthy, commercially sophisticated, and militarily capable. It would become Rome's greatest rival, and the conflict between them would define both civilizations for generations. We will come to that in time. To the east, the ghost of Alexander the Great's conquest still shaped the world. Alexander had died in 323 before the Common Era, not yet 33 years old, having carved out an empire from Greece to the borders of India. His successors, the Diadochi, the men who tore his empire apart while it was still warm, had created a Greek-speaking world that stretched from Egypt to Persia. These Hellenistic kingdoms were the great powers of the eastern Mediterranean, culturally brilliant, politically unstable, and very much aware that something unusual was happening in the west, in that scrappy hill city on the Tiber. Italy itself was home to dozens of distinct peoples. The Samnites occupied the rugged mountains of the central and southern peninsula, and would fight Rome bitterly for generations. The Latins, of whom the Romans were one group, inhabited the broad flat plain called Latium south of the Tiber. The Umbrians lived to the northeast. The Gauls, Celtic peoples who terrified every Mediterranean civilization they encountered, had swept into the Po Valley in the north of Italy and were a permanent source of anxiety. The peninsula was diverse, contested, and violent. And somewhere in the middle of all this, on 7 hills above a bend in the Tiber River, a community was beginning to form that would, over the next 12 centuries, bring all of these peoples under one authority, reach beyond Italy to encompass the entire Mediterranean world, and then collapse, leaving behind a legacy so enormous that we are still living inside it. It began, as so many world historical things do, with a story about brothers and a wolf. 7 hills and a she-wolf, the origins of Rome. Every civilization tells itself a story about its own beginning, and the story Rome told itself was extraordinary, even by the ambitious standards of ancient origin myths. It involved gods, twins, a miraculous she-wolf, a great deal of fratricide, and the kidnapping of an entire population of women. The Romans were not a people who did anything by halves, including founding mythology. The traditional Roman foundation story begins not in Italy but in Troy. When the Greeks sacked Troy, so the story goes, a Trojan prince named Aeneas escaped the burning city carrying his elderly father on his back and leading his young son by the hand. After years of wandering the Mediterranean, the Romans were clearly familiar with Homer and decided they wanted their own version of the Odyssey. Aeneas arrived in Italy and eventually became the ancestor of the Roman people. This story mattered enormously to Romans for reasons that will become clear. It tied them to the great tradition of Greek epic poetry, gave them respectable ancestors in the Trojan royal family, and explained why they felt entitled to a certain grandeur. If your great-great-great-grandfather helped bring down Troy, you come with a certain pedigree. Several generations after Aeneas, twin boys were born to a royal woman named Rhea Silvia and the god Mars. Because of course their father was a god. This is Rome we're talking about. These twins, Romulus and Remus, were thrown into the Tiber River by a treacherous great-uncle who wanted to eliminate them as rivals. The river carried them safely to the base of the Palatine Hill, where a she-wolf found them and nursed them, until a shepherd named Faustulus discovered them and raised them as his own sons. When they grew up, they deposed the treacherous great-uncle, restored their grandfather to his throne, and then decided to found a city of their own, on the hills where they had been found as infants. This is where the story turns darker. The brothers could not agree on which hill to build the city on, and the dispute devolved into an argument about which of them had received a more favourable omen from the birds. Remus saw 6 vultures, Romulus saw 12. Romulus won the argument, began building a wall around the Palatine Hill, and Remus, apparently unable to let it go, jumped over the half-built wall as a joke or a gesture of contempt. Romulus killed him. Some versions say it was done in rage, others say it was a deliberate founding sacrifice. Either way, the city of Rome began with a brother killing his brother, which tells you something about how the Romans understood themselves. Romulus then needed citizens for his new city. His solution was to declare Rome a refuge for the dispossessed, the fugitive, and the runaway. Escaped slaves, exiles, criminals, and wanderers arrived from across Latium, swelling the population. But the population was overwhelmingly male. Romulus needed women. His solution was the rape of the Sabine women, which in ancient usage meant the abduction rather than the modern definition, though the ancient version was not exactly pleasant either. He invited the neighbouring Sabine people to a festival, and at a signal his men seized the Sabine women and drove their families away. The Sabine men returned with an army, but by the time the battle began, the Sabine women themselves intervened, throwing themselves between the armies and begging both sides to stop. The Romans and Sabines eventually merged into a single people. It is an unusual founding story by any standard. Now, how much of this is real? Essentially none of the Romulus and Remus narrative can be taken as historical fact. The twins, the wolf, the founding murder, these are foundation myths, stories a culture tells to explain what it values and where it comes from. The Romans knew perfectly well that these were myths, or at least the educated ones did. The historian Livy, writing around the time of the first Emperor Augustus, introduces the story with remarkable candour, essentially saying that he is not going to argue about whether these events happened, because the antiquity of the whole thing puts it beyond verification. What archaeology tells us is different from myth, but no less interesting. The hills above the Tiber were settled by Latin-speaking peoples from at least the 10th century before the Common Era. Evidence of habitation on the Palatine Hill dates back to around 900 before the Common Era. By the 8th century, there were villages on multiple hills. These communities were not dramatically different from dozens of other Latin settlements in the region, small, agricultural, organised around kinship and local ritual. The traditional date for Rome's founding is 753 before the Common Era. This date was calculated much later by Roman scholars working backward through king lists and other records of varying reliability. Modern archaeology suggests that the area was indeed developing into something more like an organised community around the 8th century, which puts the traditional date in the right general vicinity, even if the specific year is a scholarly confection. What seems to have happened is that sometime in the 8th or 7th century before the Common Era, the separate communities on the different hills began to unify. The low marshy ground between the hills was drained, an enormous engineering effort for the time, creating the space that would become the Roman Forum. The villages on the separate hills began to function as a single settlement. A community became a city, and that city sat in a remarkably advantageous position. The Tiber was navigable from the sea to this point, making it a natural node of river commerce. The hills provided defensible ground. The surrounding plain of Latium was fertile. The city sat roughly in the middle of the Italian peninsula, well positioned to expand in multiple directions. Rome's location was not an accident of divine will. It was good geography, and good geography is the silent engine of a great deal of history. The Romans themselves could not have fully understood this at the time. They were still living in huts with thatched roofs, burying their dead in simple graves, farming the surrounding fields, tending livestock, and managing the eternal negotiations of small community life. They did not know they were the founding generation of anything in particular. They were just trying to get through the winter. But something was beginning. Something that the wolf, had she been capable of foresight, might have raised her head to sense. Kings, priests, and early power, the Roman monarchy. Rome, before it was a republic, before it was an empire, was a kingdom. This is the part of Roman history that gets the least attention, partly because the Romans themselves were somewhat embarrassed about it. The republic was their proudest achievement, and the empire was their most famous one, and the monarchy that preceded both tended to get treated as a slightly awkward prologue. But the monarchical period shaped Rome in ways that lasted long after the last king was gone, and it is worth spending some time there. The Roman tradition held that there were 7 kings of Rome, reigning from the founding in 753 down to the expulsion of the last king in 510 before the Common Era. 7 is a suspiciously tidy number for a period of 2.5 centuries, and historians treat the early king list with considerable skepticism. The first few kings in particular, Romulus, Numa Pompilius, Tullus Hostilius, Ancus Mardius, exist somewhere between legend and dim historical memory, probably preserving very old traditions about important political or religious developments, but not functioning as reliable biographies. Romulus himself, the city's founder, was said to have disappeared in a thunderstorm and been taken directly to heaven to become the god Quirinus. This is one of those details that tells you everything about how the Romans processed the end of powerful rulers. When in doubt, deification. This habit would prove extremely durable. Numa Pompilius, the second king, was remembered as the great religious organizer of early Rome. He was said to have established Rome's priestly colleges, its religious calendar, and the various cults and rites that would define Roman religious life for centuries. Whether or not a single individual named Numa did all of this, the memory preserves something real. The formalization of Roman religion did happen during the early period, and it was intimately connected to the structures of power. In Rome, religion and politics were never separate. The priesthoods were not separate from the government. They were part of it. The Romans had a rich and complex array of religious officials. The pontiffs oversaw the correct performance of sacred rites. The augurs interpreted the will of the gods through the observation of birds and other natural signs. And this was not merely ceremonial, it had direct political consequences. A military campaign could be cancelled, an election invalidated, a law overturned if the augurs declared that the omens were unfavourable. The flamens were priests dedicated to specific gods. The Vestal Virgins, 6 women who tended the sacred fire of the goddess Vesta, held extraordinary social prestige and legal privileges extraordinary by any Roman standard. If a Vestal passed a prisoner being led to execution, the prisoner was freed. They were that important. The later kings in the tradition are more plausibly historical. Tarquinius Priscus, Servius Tullius, and Tarquinius Superbus are generally believed to have been real rulers, and it is no coincidence that these last 3 kings were Etruscans, or closely connected to Etruscan culture. This is where archaeology and tradition align in interesting ways. The archaeological record shows significant Etruscan influence on early Rome during the 6th century before the Common Era, in building techniques, in artistic style, in the organisation of political and religious life. Rome was, for a period, something close to an Etruscan city. The Etruscans introduced or developed in Rome the tradition of the triumph, the great ceremonial procession in which a victorious general rode through the city in a chariot, dressed in the costume of a god, his face painted red, his army marching behind him. The triumph would become one of Rome's most defining institutions, the ultimate reward of military success, the moment every ambitious Roman man spent his career working toward. It came, at least in part, from Etruria. The last of the 7 kings was Tarquinius Superbus, Tarquin the Proud. His name tells you how the tradition remembered him. He was a tyrant in the original Greek sense of the word, not necessarily cruel in all things, but ruling without the consent of the governed, setting himself above the law, treating the Senate as irrelevant, and generally behaving as though the opinion of Rome's aristocratic families was a thing beneath his notice. He built on a grand scale, completing the great Temple of Jupiter on the Capitoline Hill, and he was a capable military leader. But his personal conduct and his family's behaviour were, according to tradition, intolerable. The crisis came when his son Sextus Tarquinius raped a noblewoman named Lucretia. She summoned her father and her husband, told them what had happened, made them swear to avenge her, and then killed herself. This act, the shame, the defiance, the sacrifice, ignited the revolution that ended the monarchy. Lucretia became one of Rome's foundational heroines, her story told and retold as the moment that made the Republic necessary and the kings impossible. Whether the rape of Lucretia happened exactly as described, or happened at all, is a question that cannot be answered with certainty. What is clear is that around 509 before the Common Era, the last Tarquin king was expelled from Rome, and the Romans made a decision that would echo for 5 centuries. They would never again have a king. The Latin word rex, king, became so toxic in Roman political culture that even 200 years later, in 59 before the Common Era, the mere accusation of wanting to be king was enough to ruin a politician's career. Julius Caesar's enemies used it against him. It helped get him killed. The monarchy left Rome with several things that persisted long after the kings were gone. It left the religious institutions, the priesthoods, the sacred calendar, the rites and auguries that governed every aspect of public life. It left the Senate, the advisory body of leading men that the kings had consulted and that the Republic would eventually transform into something far more powerful. It left the social structure of patricians and plebeians, the ancient aristocratic families and the common people, whose tension would drive Roman politics for centuries, and it left the deep bone-level conviction that power must be shared, checked, and limited, that no one man should hold it alone. That conviction was about to be tested. The Republic is born. Overthrowing the kings. The moment the last Tarquin was driven out, the Romans faced a problem they had never faced before. They had a city, a senate, a population that needed governing, armies that needed leading, neighbours that needed managing, and a sacred fire in the Temple of Vesta that needed keeping. What they no longer had was a king. Their solution was one of the most genuinely creative acts in the history of political thought. 2 leaders instead of 1, each holding office for 1 year only, each with the power to cancel the other's decisions. These were the consuls, and the system they anchored, the Roman Republic, would function in various forms for nearly 500 years. The genius of the 2-consul system was precisely its inefficiency. 1 man with absolute power is dangerous. 2 men who can each counsel the other are considerably less so. Yes, it made swift, decisive action harder. Yes, it sometimes produced paralysis. The Romans were not naive about these costs. They built in an escape valve. The dictator, a single man appointed in genuine emergencies to hold absolute power for no more than 6 months, after which he was expected to resign and return to private life. Crucially, most of them did exactly that. The most celebrated example was Cincinnatus, a farmer-appointed dictator who solved the crisis in 15 days and went back to his fields. The Romans told this story constantly. George Washington's contemporaries knew it too, which is why they called him the American Cincinnatus. The influence of that Roman farmer on the founding mythology of a modern superpower is not something you encounter every day. The early republic was not a democracy in any modern sense. It was an oligarchy, ruled by the best-born, or more precisely by the people with the most land, the most clients, and the most impressive ancestors. The patricians, the ancient aristocratic families who claimed descent from Romulus's original Senate, dominated everything. They held the consulships, the priesthoods, the judicial offices. They interpreted the laws that were not yet written down, which meant that the people who knew the law and the people who made the law were conveniently the same people. This worked beautifully for the patricians and extremely badly for everyone else. The plebeians, common citizens ranging from prosperous merchants to day labourers, had essentially no formal political power. They paid taxes. They served in the army. They worked the land. They were being asked to sacrifice for a system that barely acknowledged their existence. They pushed back. And the way they pushed back was one of the most remarkable forms of political protest the ancient world ever produced. They seceded. Around 494 before the Common Era, the plebeians simply left. They marched out of Rome onto the Sacred Mount, a hill outside the city, sat down and refused to come back. No weapons, no violence, just the complete withdrawal of their labour, their military service, and their presence from a city that claimed to need them. It was, essentially, the world's first general strike, conducted with extraordinary discipline and considerable nerve. The patricians blinked. The plebeians were granted tribunes of the plebs, officials whose persons were sacrosanct, meaning any citizen could legally kill anyone who physically harmed them. The tribunes also received the power of the veto. That word. The Romans gave us that word. It means I forbid in Latin, and it remains in the political vocabulary of every state that traces itself back to Roman tradition, including the United Nations Security Council, where it causes no end of difficulty to this day. The struggle between patricians and plebeians, the conflict of the orders, ran for roughly 200 years. It was not a violent revolution. It was a long, grinding political negotiation conducted through secessions, legislation, and argument. The outcomes were significant. The 12 Tables, Rome's first written law code, produced around 450 before the Common Era, came directly from plebeian demands that the law be visible, fixed, and equal. By 287 before the Common Era, plebeians could hold the consulship, the priesthoods, and pass legislation binding on all Romans. What emerged was a new aristocracy based on achievement as much as birth, a system where new families could rise and old ones could fall, and a republic of genuine complexity. Assemblies, senate, magistrates, all balanced against each other in arrangements full of contradictions and compromises. It was gloriously, magnificently impractical. And it worked, until it didn't. But that part of the story is still some distance away. The machinery of the Republic, Senate, consuls, and Cicero's world. To understand the Roman Republic, you have to understand not just its institutions but the culture that ran through them like a current through a wire. Roman political culture was unlike anything else in the ancient world, and it produced people unlike anything else. Ambitious, educated, ruthless, eloquent, obsessively conscious of their ancestors and their own reputation, driven by a concept they called virtues that combined courage, excellence, and moral worth in a way that no single modern word quite captures. The Roman political career had a structure. It was called the cursus honorum, the course of honours, and it prescribed the sequence of offices a Roman man of ambition was expected to hold in the correct order and at the correct minimum ages. You started as a quaestor, managing financial accounts for the state, then perhaps as an aediile, responsible for public buildings, markets, and the grain supply. The aediles also funded public games, which made this office a magnificent opportunity to spend your own money buying votes. Then praetor, with judicial and military responsibilities, and finally at the top consul, the two highest magistrates who gave their names to the year and held the supreme executive power of the state. Beyond the consulship, the ambitious might seek the censorship, held every 5 years to conduct the census, manage public contracts, and oversee public morality, a job that sounds dull until you realize that the censors could expel senators from the Senate for conduct unbecoming of a senator. They were the Roman equivalent of a disciplinary committee with actual teeth. The Senate itself was a body of several hundred men, former magistrates who served for life. It met in the Curia, the Senate House, in the Roman Forum. Senators wore distinctive white togas with a broad purple stripe. They had reserved seats at the theatre and the games. They were the governing class of the most powerful state in the Mediterranean world, and they knew it, and they were deeply invested in maintaining the systems that kept them where they were. Senate meetings were conducted by elaborate rules of precedent and seniority. The presiding magistrate, usually a consul, would put a question and then call on senators to speak, beginning with the most senior. In theory, this meant business could move fairly efficiently. In practice, it meant that a determined senator could speak on a topic for as long as physically possible, preventing a vote from being taken. The filibuster, in other words. 2,000 years before the United States Senate, the Romans were already weaponizing the floor speech. Now, into this world in 106 before the Common Era, a boy was born in the town of Arpinum in central Italy, who would become the most eloquent voice Rome ever produced, and one of the most eloquent voices in the history of Western civilization. His name was Marcus Tullius Cicero, and he is worth dwelling on because he is in many ways the Republic incarnate. Its highest ideals, its crushing failures, its extraordinary productivity, and its ultimately tragic end all embodied in a single, restless, brilliant, vain, courageous human being. Cicero was not from a patrician family. He was not even from a noble family. He was an eques, a member of the equestrian class, comfortable, prosperous, educated, but not one of the great dynastic families that had held power for generations. In the Roman system, this made him a novus homo, a new man, a term that carried both the meaning of fresh talent and the condescension of the established elite. Making it to the consulship as a new man was like being the first person in your family to attend a certain school and then winning the school prize. Everyone is impressed and a little suspicious. Cicero got there anyway. He was consul in 63 before the Common Era, and during his consulship faced the Catilinarian conspiracy, an attempted revolution by an indebted aristocrat named Catiline, who planned to burn Rome and seize power by force. Cicero uncovered the plot, had the conspirators executed without trial, which was controversial and would haunt him, and delivered 4 speeches against Catiline in the Senate that have been studied for their rhetorical technique for 2,000 years. His opening line of the first speech, O tempora, O mores, meaning O the times, O the customs, is still quoted today, usually by people who are unhappy about something and want to feel Roman about it. What Cicero believed, what he articulated more clearly than anyone before him, was that the Republic was not just a system of government. It was a moral community, a shared project of civilization, sustained by the virtue of its citizens and particularly its leaders. When leaders became corrupt, when ambition overcame principle, when the institutions were used as tools of personal power rather than as servants of the common good, the Republic was in danger. He spent the last years of his life watching exactly that happen, and writing and speaking against it with everything he had. He was killed in 43 before the Common Era, his head and hands nailed to the speaker's platform in the Roman Forum, the Rostra, on the orders of Mark Antony, whose political career Cicero had tried to destroy with 14 devastating speeches known as the Philippics. Antony's wife Fulvia reportedly took Cicero's severed tongue and stabbed it repeatedly with her hairpin, the Republic's greatest orator silenced in the most literal possible way. It is difficult to read about Cicero's death without feeling something. He was imperfect, obviously, vain, often self-congratulatory, occasionally cowardly and capable of sharp cruelty in his letters. But he believed genuinely in something larger than himself, and he died for it, and the thing he believed in died with him, or almost with him. The Republic had been failing long before Cicero's execution. He was simply the last person to argue articulately against the failure. Before we reach that failure, we need to understand how Rome became powerful enough that its failure could matter to the whole world. Rome goes to war, the conquest of Italy. The Roman Republic did not set out to conquer Italy. This is important to understand. There was no master plan, no grand strategic vision in the early centuries, no meeting in the Senate where someone said, "Right, we are going to take the entire peninsula step by step over the next 200 years. What there was, instead, was a series of immediate problems: threatening neighbours, defensive wars, violated treaties, requests for help from allied cities, each of which, when addressed by Roman military force, left Rome in a slightly stronger position than before, which created new neighbours who felt threatened, which created new wars, which left Rome in an even stronger position. Expansion was, in this sense, the product of a system that generated expansion almost automatically, not of a plan. The early Republic spent much of the 5th century before the Common Era simply surviving. The city had powerful enemies in every direction. The Etruscans to the north, the Aequi and Volsci in the hills around Latium, the Sabines, and a rotating cast of Latin cities who alternated between being Roman allies and Roman enemies depending on the political weather. The Romans won some of these wars and lost others, but they were learning how to organize their army, how to supply it, how to integrate defeated peoples into their political system. That last point deserves emphasis. The way Rome dealt with defeated enemies was unusual in the ancient world, and probably its single greatest strategic advantage. When Rome conquered a city or a people, it did not typically enslave them all, or kill them all, or simply tax them into misery. It offered them some form of relationship with Rome. At the top of the scale, a defeated community might receive full Roman citizenship, becoming Roman in a legal sense. In the middle were the Latin rights, a status that gave significant legal privileges and usually a path to full citizenship. At the lower end were treaty relationships that required military service in exchange for alliance and protection. This system meant that every Roman victory potentially added not just territory but people, soldiers, farmers, taxpayers, to Rome's side. Carthage, by contrast, tended to rule its subjects through Carthaginian governors and mercenary armies. When Carthage suffered a defeat, its subjects had little reason to remain loyal. When Rome suffered a defeat, its allies, who had been promised and in many cases given genuine benefits, were more likely to stay. This asymmetry mattered enormously over time. The greatest crisis of the early Republic came not from a Latin neighbour, but from across the Alps. In around 390 before the Common Era, a Gallic tribe called the Senones swept into northern Italy, defeated a Roman army at the Battle of the Allia River, and sacked Rome. This was, to put it gently, not a good day for the city. The Gauls occupied most of Rome and held it for several months. The capital hill held out, defended by its garrison, and, according to the charming Roman tradition, warned of a nocturnal attack by the cackling of the sacred geese of Juno, who made enough noise to wake the guards. The geese of the capital were thereafter maintained at public expense and treated with considerable respect. If you ever feel like your job is thankless, consider that for several centuries there were Roman officials whose duties included the ritual care of geese. The Gauls eventually left after receiving a substantial payment in gold. The Romans swore they would never pay tribute again. They rebuilt. And then something changed. What changed is hard to pinpoint precisely, but it seems to involve a new confidence, a new organisational efficiency, and possibly new military techniques. The Romans reorganised their army in the early 4th century, moving away from the Greek-style phalanx, a tight formation of infantry with overlapping shields, toward a more flexible system based on smaller units called maniples that could operate more independently on broken ground. This was the kind of adaptation that separated armies that were learning from armies that were not. By 340 before the Common Era, Rome controlled most of Latium and was ready to project power further. The Latin War of 340 to 338 before the Common Era ended with Rome dissolving the Latin League, incorporating some Latin cities as full Roman citizens and giving others Latin status. The pattern was set. The Samnite Wars, 3 long conflicts fought against the mountain people of central southern Italy between 343 and 290 before the Common Era, were the hardest test Rome faced before Carthage. The Samnites were fierce fighters in difficult terrain. Rome lost significant battles, and once, at the Caudine Forks in 321, suffered a humiliation that burned in the Roman memory for generations. An entire Roman army forced to pass under the yoke in submission. The Romans remembered this. They came back. They always came back. By 272 before the Common Era, when the great Greek city of Tarentum in southern Italy submitted to Rome, the conquest of the Italian peninsula was essentially complete. Rome now controlled, directly through colonies or through treaty alliances, virtually all of Italy south of the Po Valley. It had a population of allies and citizens numbering in the millions. It had a military tradition tested in 2 centuries of almost constant warfare. It had administrative experience, legal sophistication, and a political system that had survived crises that would have destroyed less resilient states. It was now, for the first time, a Mediterranean power. It was about to discover what that meant. Carthage must be destroyed. The Punic Wars. There is a Roman senator named Marcus Porcius Cato, Cato the Elder, a man so relentlessly severe that he makes every moral reformer you have ever encountered seem positively hedonistic, who reportedly ended every speech he gave in the Senate, regardless of the topic, with the words Carthago delenda est. Carthage must be destroyed. He did this for years, when the Senate debated grain prices, when the Senate discussed road construction, every single time, because he believed with every fibre of his deeply fiberish soul that Carthage alive was Rome at risk. He was not entirely wrong. Carthage was one of the great cities of the ancient world, fabulously wealthy, commercially brilliant, militarily capable and strategically positioned to dominate the Western Mediterranean. Its harbour was an engineering marvel. Its merchant fleet was the largest in the sea. It controlled Sicily, Sardinia, and the coasts of Spain, and it had the relationship with the Western Mediterranean that great powers tend to develop with their backyards: proprietary, defensive, and not remotely interested in sharing. Rome and Carthage had managed a working relationship for centuries, with treaties going back to 500 before the Common Era. But when Rome finished conquering Italy and looked across the water towards Sicily, the world's most fought-over island, the calculus changed. The First Punic War began in 264 before the Common Era and ran for 23 years. It started over a minor incident in Sicily that neither side had planned to turn into a full-scale war. What made it remarkable was what the Romans did to fight it. Rome had no fleet. Carthage had the best navy in the Mediterranean. Rather than acknowledge this disadvantage, the Romans built a fleet from scratch, using a captured Carthaginian ship as a model according to legend, and then defeated Carthage at sea through engineering innovation and sheer Roman stubbornness. The innovation was the corvus, a boarding bridge dropped onto enemy ships to lock them together, turning a naval battle into something that looked more like a land battle. It was not subtle. It was enormously effective. The war ended in 241 with Rome victorious and Sicily becoming Rome's first overseas province, the template for everything that followed. The peace was not stable. During Carthage's subsequent internal troubles, Rome seized Sardinia and Corsica in a move that even many Romans admitted was not exactly honourable. That stored-up resentment would bear terrible fruit, delivered by a man named Hannibal Barca. Hannibal is one of the most extraordinary military figures in the history of the world, and that is not hyperbole. In 218 before the Common Era, he led an army from Spain, across the Pyrenees, through southern Gaul, and then across the Alps in autumn with elephants. The elephants did not fare particularly well and most of them died, but the army got through, and what followed was the Second Punic War, which came closer to destroying Rome than anything before or after. Hannibal spent 15 years in Italy, winning battle after extraordinary battle. At Lake Trasimene in 217 he executed the largest ambush in recorded military history. At Cannae in 216 he faced perhaps 80,000 Romans with a smaller force, deliberately let them push into his centre, and folded his stronger flanks around them like a pair of hands closing. Between 50 and 70,000 Romans died in a single day. The Senate lost dozens of members. The historian Livy wrote that Rome had never been in such a desperate state, and then Rome did the thing it always did. It kept going. After Cannae they did not surrender. They did not negotiate. They enrolled slaves into new legions, called up teenagers below legal military age, and refused to receive any Carthaginian ambassador. They adopted the grinding strategy of Fabius Maximus: avoid direct battle, harass, exhaust, mocked at first and eventually vindicated entirely. The war turned when a young general named Scipio took the fight to Spain, and then to North Africa, threatening Carthage itself. Hannibal, still undefeated in Italy, was recalled home. At Zama in 202 the two greatest generals of the age finally met, and this time the encircling tactics belonged to Rome. Carthage surrendered. 50 years later, prosperous again through trade, Carthage made Cato nervous once more. The Third Punic War was launched on a pretext. The city besieged for 3 years, and then destroyed completely. Population killed or enslaved, buildings razed, ground reportedly salted. Cato did not live to see it. But if he had, he would have nodded, and then probably given another speech about the dangers of luxury. The cost of empire. Slaves, generals, and broken promises wars have consequences, and the consequences of Rome's wars of conquest, particularly the Punic Wars and the subsequent wars in Greece and the East, were transformative in ways that were not uniformly positive. The Mediterranean world in the 2nd century before the Common Era looked dramatically different from the world of 50 years earlier, and Rome was at the centre of those changes. Some of what changed was good. Some of it was, frankly, a catastrophe for large numbers of people, including eventually for the Republic itself. The most visible consequence was slaves, an enormous number of them. The ancient world was not without slavery before Rome, but the scale of Roman slaveholding reached by the 2nd century before the Common Era was extraordinary. After major campaigns, tens of thousands of prisoners of war were sold into slavery. The fall of Epirus in 167 before the Common Era produced 150,000 slaves from a single campaign. Carthage's fall added more, Every major conquest added more. By the 1st century before the Common Era, perhaps 1/3 of the population of Italy was enslaved. 1/3 slaves worked in every sector of the Roman economy. They cooked food and tutored children in the houses of wealthy Romans. They built roads and aqueducts for the state. They waited tables in taverns and ran shops in the city. And in the largest numbers and worst conditions, they worked in chain gangs on the great agricultural estates, the latifundia, that were consuming the farmland of Italy. This is where the economics become grim. The influx of war captives had driven down the price of slaves dramatically. Meanwhile, Rome's wars required Roman citizens, specifically small farmers who owned enough land to qualify for military service, to spend years away from home on campaigns. When they returned, their farms had deteriorated, their families had struggled, and they often faced debts they could not repay. And the land next to their farm had probably been bought up by a wealthy Roman who was running it with slave labour, which could undercut their prices. The small farmer, the backbone of the Roman legions, the citizen soldier who was supposed to be the foundation of the Republic, was being squeezed out. This was not a marginal problem. It was existential. An army of small landowners is one thing, an army of landless men who have nothing to fight for. Or worse, an army of men who have been given land as a reward for military service, and are therefore personally loyal to the general who arranged that reward rather than to the state, is something very different. The military and political implications of the collapse of the peasant class would take a generation to fully reveal themselves, but they were already building pressure underground like a fault line being slowly loaded. The wealth flowing into Rome was also changing the culture, and not in ways the older generation found comfortable. Exposure to Greek civilization, through conquest in Greece itself, through contact with the Greek cities of southern Italy, through the flood of Greek slaves who ended up as tutors in Roman households, was transforming what educated Romans read, thought, admired, and aspired to. Greek philosophy, Greek rhetoric, Greek art, Greek literature, all of this was entering Roman life rapidly, and some Romans found it exhilarating and others found it deeply threatening. Cato the Elder, that obsessive destroyer of Carthage, was equally obsessive about the corrupting influence of Greek culture. He wrote manuals on agriculture and speeches and a history of Rome in Latin, partly as a corrective to what he saw as the fashionable preference for Greek models. He distrusted Greek doctors. He thought they were poisoning their patients deliberately. He distrusted Greek philosophers. When a Greek philosophical delegation came to Rome in 155 before the Common Era and delighted Roman audiences with debates on the nature of justice, Cato got them expelled from the city as fast as he possibly could. He was fighting a tide he could not stop, and he knew it, and he kept fighting anyway. In its own way, this is admirable. Exhausting, but admirable. The generals who led the great conquest were changing too. Military success on this scale required years of continuous campaigning, and years of continuous campaigning built deep bonds of loyalty between soldiers and their commanders. The general who had led you through Spain or Greece or Asia Minor, who had made sure you were fed and paid, who had won you victory and plunder, was a more concrete and immediate presence in your life than the distant Senate in Rome. This shift in loyalties, from the state to the individual general, was slow but significant. It was building towards something that would ultimately destroy the Republic. But that was still 50 years away. For now, Rome was at the height of its power, and in the early stages of its success, eating itself alive. The feast was magnificent. The indigestion would be historic. The Republic cracks, the Gracchi brothers, and the beginning of the end. In 133 before the Common Era, a tribune of the plebs named Tiberius Sempronius Gracchus stood up in the popular assembly and proposed something that sounds almost boring by the standards of what the 20th century would consider radical politics, but was, in the context of Rome, approximately as inflammatory as setting fire to the Senate House directly. He proposed enforcing the existing laws on land ownership. The Roman state had acquired enormous amounts of public land, the Asia Publicus, through conquest. The law said that citizens could use this public land but could not own it privately, and there were limits on how much any individual could lease from the state. These laws had been quietly ignored for generations. Wealthy Romans had essentially taken over vast tracts of public land, treating them as private property, working them with slaves, and using their political connections to ensure that no one made a fuss about it. Tiberius Gracchus proposed redistributing this land to the landless poor, giving them the farms that would restore them to military eligibility and economic stability. The Senate was not pleased. The Senate was, in many cases, composed of the very people whose illegal landholdings would be affected. Tiberius found his colleague in the tribunate, Marcus Octavius, being used by the Senate as a tool to veto his proposals. Tiberius did something unprecedented. He moved to have Octavius removed from office by popular vote, a tribune removing another tribune. The legal basis was debatable, to say the least. The precedent was disastrous. Tiberius pushed through his land reform law, and then, when the question of his re-election to the tribunate arose, which was itself probably against the unwritten rules, the situation exploded. A group of senators and their clients, armed with clubs and broken furniture, attacked Tiberius and his supporters in the Forum. Tiberius Gracchus was beaten to death. His body was thrown into the Tiber. This was the moment the Republic crossed a line it had never crossed before. Political violence in the heart of Rome. A tribune of the plebs, a person who was supposed to be sacrosanct, literally untouchable, murdered by a mob led by members of the Senate. In 500 years of the Republic, this had not happened. The rules that governed Roman political competition had always included one fundamental rule. You did not physically harm your opponents. You might ruin them financially, destroy their reputation, exile them, or force them to suicide. Roman political culture had plenty of sharp edges, but you did not beat them to death in public. After Tiberius, you did. His younger brother Gaius Sempronius Gracchus was elected tribune 10 years later, in 123 before the Common Era, and pursued a far more comprehensive reform program, more extensive land redistribution, grain subsidies for the poor, extension of citizenship to Italian allies, reform of the jury courts. He was more radical than his brother and more politically sophisticated, building a wider coalition and moving faster. He served as tribune for 2 years in a row, which was also bending the rules. When he stood for a third tribunate and failed to win election, his political position collapsed rapidly. His opponents, led by a consul named Lucius Opimius, obtained from the Senate a declaration that would become one of the most controversial documents in Roman legal history, the Senatus Consultum Ultimum, the ultimate decree of the Senate, which instructed the consuls to take whatever measures were necessary to defend the state. This was, essentially, the Senate declaring martial law. Gaius Gracchus and his supporters gathered on the Aventine Hill. Violence broke out. Gaius either killed himself or had a slave do it rather than be taken. 3,000 of his supporters were killed. Opimius was later prosecuted for killing citizens without trial and was acquitted. The Gracchi brothers are remembered, depending on who is remembering them, as either heroic reformers who tried to save the Republic from itself, or as irresponsible demagogues who introduced political violence and norm-breaking that ultimately destroyed it. They were probably both. History is not tidy in this way. Their land reforms were genuine and needed. Their methods were constitutionally questionable. The reaction against them was murderous. All of this is true simultaneously. What they represent is the Republic discovering that its institutions were not adequate to manage the tensions that its own success had created. The conflicts between rich and poor, between Senate and people, between those who had land and those who did not. These were real conflicts over real resources, and the Republic's political system, which had been designed for a city-state and was now running an empire, was bending under the load. The cracks were spreading. The politicians who came after the Gracchi would not make them smaller. Marius, Sulla, and the First Civil Wars. The man who followed the Gracchi into Roman political history was not a Roman aristocrat. He was a new man from Arpinum, the same Italian town that would later produce Cicero, named Gaius Marius, and he was as unlike the refined senatorial ideal as a man could be while still becoming consul. He was blunt where the senatorial tradition required urbanity. He was a professional soldier, genuinely gifted at it. At a moment when Rome desperately needed professional soldiers, Rome was facing a crisis in the north of Africa. A king named Jugurtha in Numidia was proving impossible to defeat, partly because of his own considerable abilities, and partly because the war was being half-heartedly managed by aristocratic commanders who seemed more interested in enriching themselves than in winning. Marius used the public anger over this failure to get himself elected consul in 107 before the Common Era on a platform of military competence over aristocratic birth. This was already a provocation. What he did next was a revolution. Marius reformed the Roman army. The property qualification for military service, which had been eroding for years as the small farmer class shrank, was effectively abolished. Marius enrolled men who owned nothing, the capita censi, the head count, who had previously been excluded from military service because the army was theoretically a citizen soldier force that provided its own equipment. Now the state would provide equipment. Anyone could enlist. This solved an immediate recruitment problem and created a long-term political catastrophe of the First Order. An army of propertied citizen soldiers who have farms to go back to is an army with its own economic basis. It is loyal to the state that protects its property and its rights. An army of men who own nothing, who have nothing to go back to, who depend on military service for their living and on their general for their land allotment when they demobilize. That army is loyal to its general. Personal loyalty. The kind that crosses lines that institutional loyalty would not cross, including eventually the line of marching on Rome itself. Marius won his wars, defeated Jugurtha, then turned north to defeat two Germanic tribes, the Cimbrian Teutons, who had been threatening northern Italy and Gaul in a series of victories that were genuinely impressive militarily. He was elected consul 6 times, unprecedented, the law said once, re-election only after a 10-year gap, but emergencies and popular pressure bent the rules. He became the great man of Rome, and then he found himself, in his old age, outmaneuvered by a younger man who understood what the new army meant. Lucius Cornelius Sulla was everything Marius was not. An aristocrat of impeccable lineage, polished, calculating, with a cold intelligence that Marius's blunt power could not match politically. He was also a genuinely able general, and when Rome needed someone to fight Mithridates, the powerful king of Pontus in Asia Minor who had declared war on Rome and orchestrated the massacre of 80,000 Roman citizens in a single day in 88 before the Common Era, the Senate gave Sulla the command. Marius wanted that command. He arranged through a tribune to have it transferred to him. Sulla was at that moment camped outside Rome with his army. He did something no Roman general had done in 400 years, and that the rules, written and unwritten, absolutely prohibited. He marched his army on Rome, the city fell in hours, Marius fled, Sulla held elections, passed some legislation, declared Marius and his allies enemies of the state, and then marched east to fight Mithridates. The moment he left, Marius came back. Marius took Rome, declared Sulla an enemy of the state, and conducted a brief reign of terror in which Sulla's supporters were killed. Marius died of natural causes in 86, which was probably the only way anyone was going to stop him. Sulla spent 5 years fighting Mithridates, reaching a compromise settlement that left Mithridates technically in place, but chastened, and then marched back to Italy. Civil war, battles across the peninsula, Sulla prevailed. In 82, before the Common Era, he entered Rome for the second time at the head of an army, had himself appointed dictator, but with the traditional 6-month limit removed, and proceeded to conduct systematic political murder on a scale Rome had never seen. The prescriptions. Lists were published with the names of men who were enemies of the state. Anyone who killed a prescribed man was rewarded. Anyone who sheltered a prescribed man was also killed. The property of the prescribed was confiscated and sold. Perhaps 2,000 men died in the prescriptions, many of them killed simply because someone wanted their land. The young Julius Caesar, who had married into the Marian faction, was nearly on one of these lists. He survived by a combination of family connections, a genuine illness at the time, and the intercession of Vestal virgins on his behalf, which is not the kind of detail you make up. Sulla used his dictatorial power to reform the constitution in the direction of senatorial supremacy, restoring the Senate's power, weakening the tribunate, setting age limits for magistracies, forbidding re-election to the consulship. He was trying to put the walls back up that the Gracchian Marius had knocked down, and then, in 79 before the Common Era, he resigned his dictatorship, retired to his country estate, and died the following year, probably of liver failure. His last act was to write his memoirs, in which he gave himself the surname Felix, the Fortunate, and expressed the view that he was the luckiest man who had ever lived. He had marched on Rome twice, killed thousands, rewritten the constitution, and died peacefully in his bed. From a certain angle, he was not wrong. What he left behind was a template. The template said, if you have an army loyal to you personally, and you are determined enough, you can take power in Rome. The Senate, the laws, the sacred traditions, all of it could be swept aside by a man with enough soldiers. The next generation of Roman generals studied this lesson carefully. Caesar, the man who broke the Republic. Julius Caesar is one of those figures about whom almost everything has been said. Many of the things said contradict each other, and somehow all of them are partly right. greatest general of his age, gifted writer, brilliant politician, genuinely charming in person by all accounts, also ambitious beyond any defensible limit, willing to sacrifice the republic he had served for his own power, and he knew it, and he did it anyway. He was born in 100 before the Common Era into the patrician Julii family, which claimed descent from the goddess Venus through Aeneas. Every Roman aristocrat had impressive ancestors, but the Julii took it to a theatrical extreme. The family was patrician but not particularly wealthy, and Caesar spent his early career in serious debt. A common condition among Roman aristocrats who needed to spend money on campaigns and public generosity before winning enough office to recoup anything. He navigated the dangerous years of Sulla's proscriptions carefully, never becoming prominent enough to be a target, and rose steadily through the standard offices. As a deal, he staged 100 pairs of gladiators. Rome had never seen anything like it. The crowd-pleasing extravagance was a deliberate investment. You spent money now to buy goodwill you cashed in later as votes. Very Roman. He was elected Pontifex Maximus, chief priest of Rome, in 63 before the Common Era, which was remarkable given his age. According to tradition, he told his mother that morning he would either return as Pontifex Maximus or not return at all. He had borrowed so much to bribe voters that losing would have been financially fatal. He won. His real opportunity came in 58 before the Common Era with the governorship of Gaul. He used 9 years of nearly continuous warfare to conquer what is now France, Belgium, parts of Switzerland and Germany, and to launch 2 expeditions to Britain that were more press tour than conquest but made excellent reading back in Rome. The human cost was enormous. Estimates suggest 1 million Gauls killed and another million enslaved. Caesar reported this in his dispatches with crisp efficiency, as though it were a logistics problem that had been satisfactorily resolved. While campaigning in Gaul, he had formed the first triumvirate with 2 of Rome's most powerful men, Pompey the Great, the celebrated general who had reorganized the eastern Mediterranean, and Marcus Licinius Crassus, the richest man in Rome, who had made his fortune partly by buying burning buildings at distressed prices and extinguishing the fire only if the owner sold quickly enough. That is actually how he did it. Roman real estate was a peculiar business. The alliance was unstable from the start, and when Caesar's daughter Julia, who had married Pompey to cement the arrangement, died in 54, and Crassus died the following year at Carrhae against the Parthians, the whole structure dissolved and 2 giants faced each other. The Senate, alarmed by Caesar's accumulated power, demanded he return from Gaul and stand trial. Caesar knew that as a private citizen he was vulnerable. He asked permission to stand for the consulship in absentia. The Senate refused. In January 49 before the Common Era, Caesar stood on the northern bank of the Rubicon River, the legal boundary between his province and Italy, with his army. Crossing with troops was treason. He paused. Ancient sources give him various things to say at this moment. Whatever he actually said, the meaning was plain. He crossed anyway. The civil war was astonishingly swift. Pharsalus in 48 broke Pompey, who fled to Egypt and was murdered on the beach by men who thought they were doing Caesar a favour. Caesar reportedly wept at the sight of Pompey's severed head. They had been enemies, but they had been family once too, and the sight of what the world had come to was apparently genuinely affecting. By 45 before the Common Era, Caesar controlled everything. The dictatorship was declared perpetual. He pardoned enemies, made grand plans, accepted extraordinary honours in ways that suggested he expected rather than welcomed them. There were whispers about kings. On the 15th of March, 44 before the Common Era, he was stabbed 23 times on the steps of the Senate chamber by 60 conspirators, several of whom he had personally pardoned. He fell at the base of a statue of Pompey and pulled his toga over his face as he died. The conspirators had killed a man. They had not killed an idea. That distinction would matter enormously in the years that followed. The death of Caesar and the wars that followed. The conspirators who killed Caesar called themselves liberators. They had freed the Republic from a tyrant, and they expected gratitude. They expected the Roman people to recognize the justice of what had been done, and to rally around the restored senatorial order. They expected, essentially, for things to go back to normal. They were wrong about almost everything. The Roman people did not celebrate. They mourned. Not because they were incapable of understanding republicanism, but because Caesar had been genuinely popular. His land grants, his veteran settlements, his public building programs, his games, his personal accessibility, All of it had built him real support among the urban poor and the veterans. When Mark Antony, Caesar's loyal lieutenant and co-consul, staged a public funeral for Caesar and read Caesar's will aloud to the crowd, revealing that Caesar had left money and gardens to the people of Rome, and then allegedly held up Caesar's blood-soaked toga to the crowd, the response was immediate and violent. The people of Rome burned Caesar's body in the Forum and then took fire from the pyre to attack the houses of the conspirators. Brutus and Cassius fled the city within weeks. The republic these men had tried to restore did not re-emerge. What emerged instead was another round of civil war, this time among Caesar's heirs and his killers. Mark Antony initially seemed to be the dominant figure, Caesar's most important lieutenant currently holding the consulship, with Caesar's papers and fortune in his possession. But Caesar had left his estate and, crucially, his name to a young man who was not yet 19 years old, his great-nephew Gaius Octavius, who upon accepting the inheritance renamed himself Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus, and immediately began using the name Caesar as a political weapon. Octavian, as historians call him in this period, was physically not impressive. He was young, slight, prone to illness, not a soldier in any obvious sense. He was also possessed of a cold, precise, absolutely ruthless political intelligence that would prove to be the most formidable in Rome since Caesar himself, and perhaps superior to Caesar's in one crucial respect: patience. Caesar had been impatient. Octavian could wait. The politics of the years between 44 and 31 before the Common Era were fantastically complex. Shifting alliances, military campaigns, the second triumvirate between Octavian, Antony, and a largely ineffectual third figure named Lepidus, the renewed proscriptions that killed Cicero among thousands of others, the defeat of Brutus and Cassius at Philippi in 42, and then the slow split between Octavian and Antony. Antony went east, became entangled with Cleopatra in ways that were both politically and personally serious, married her, gave her and her children Roman territories in the so-called donations of Alexandria, and gave Octavian exactly the propaganda weapon he needed. Octavian presented the conflict as a war not between two Roman politicians, but between Rome and the decadent East, between the last defender of Roman values and a Roman renegade enthralled to an Eastern queen. At the Battle of Actium in 31 before the Common Era, Octavian's fleet under his admiral Agrippa defeated Antony and Cleopatra's combined fleet. Antony and Cleopatra fled to Egypt and killed themselves the following year. Octavian was, in the aftermath, the sole master of the Roman world. He was 32 years old. Augustus and the birth of the empire. What Octavian did next is one of the most carefully calculated political performances in the history of the world, and it worked better than almost any political performance ever has. He did not declare himself king. He did not even declare himself emperor, not in so many words. He was acutely, almost obsessively aware that Caesar had been killed in part because he seemed to want to be king, and he had no intention of making the same mistake. Instead, he did something much cleverer. He gave power back to the Senate. He made a great show of restoring the Republic. In 27 before the Common Era, he announced that he was returning all his extraordinary powers to the Senate and people of Rome, and the Senate, in what was either a genuine expression of relief and gratitude or a deeply realistic assessment of what would happen if they declined, gave it all back to him, with extra titles. They called him Augustus, the revered one, a word with religious connotations that elevated him above ordinary men without making him technically divine. They gave him powers that, taken together, added up to something like what we would call executive control of the entire state, the authority of a tribune of the plebs, which made his person sacrosanct and gave him the veto over any legislation, the imperium of a proconsul, which gave him command of all the armies, and the auctoritas, the moral weight and influence, of a man who had done what he had done and was recognized as the first man in Rome. Augustus ruled as princeps, first citizen, not king, not emperor in the formal sense, just the most important man in a republic that still had its senators and its elections and its magistrates, all of which continued to function in ways that were formally correct but practically dependent on what Augustus wanted. It was the most successful political fiction in Western history. Augustus maintained the form of the republic while establishing the substance of monarchy, and most Romans, exhausted by a century of civil wars, were willing to accept this fiction gratefully. He also delivered. His reign, which lasted from 27 before the Common Era to 14 of the Common Era, 41 years, was one of the most transformative periods in Roman history. He ended the civil wars. He created professional armies under permanent state command, paid regular salaries with defined terms of service and discharge benefits that the state guaranteed. He established the Praetorian Guard, a permanent force of elite soldiers stationed near Rome, a political decision with long-term consequences, since later emperors would live and die by the Praetorian Guard's loyalty. He reorganized the provinces, putting the ones that needed legions under his personal control and the relatively peaceful ones under senatorial governors. He built. The poet Horace wrote that Augustus found Rome a city of brick and left it a city of marble. This is not quite accurate. Rome's architectural revolution continued through later reigns. But Augustus's building program was genuinely enormous. The Forum of Augustus, the Temple of Mars the Avenger, the Arapacis, the Altar of Peace, one of the most beautiful surviving pieces of Roman art, rebuilt temples across the city, restored roads and aqueducts. The physical landscape of Rome was remade during his reign. He sponsored a cultural flowering that has become known as the Augustan Age, and it deserves the name. The poets Virgil, Horace, and Ovid produced work during this period that established Latin literature at its absolute height. Virgil's Aeneid, the great Roman national epic, tracing the Trojan origins of Rome and culminating implicitly in the glorious reign of Augustus himself, was conceived, written, and left deliberately unfinished at Virgil's death, meaning Augustus had to decide whether to publish a poem that its author had wanted destroyed. He published it. The world is richer for that decision. Livy wrote his monumental History of Rome. Ovid wrote the Metamorphoses, among other works, until he fell afoul of Augustus for reasons that remain somewhat mysterious, probably connected to the exile of Augustus's granddaughter Julia for immorality, and was banished to the Black Sea coast for the rest of his life. Even under the Augustan peace, being a poet had its risks. Augustus's personal life was complicated. He had one daughter, Julia, by his first wife, and no sons of his own. He became consumed by the problem of succession, one of the fundamental weaknesses of the imperial system he had created, which had no formal mechanism for choosing the next ruler. He worked through a series of intended heirs who died before him, his nephew Marcellus, his grandsons Gaius and Lucius, before settling on his stepson Tiberius, whom he adopted and who succeeded him in 14 of the Common Era. Augustus himself died quietly at the age of 75, reportedly asking whether he had played his part in the comedy of life well enough, and if so, applaud his exit. His last word was reportedly Livia, the name of his wife for 52 years. He was declared a god by the Senate after his death. His month, Sextilis, had already been renamed August in his honour, joining July, renamed for Julius Caesar, in the calendar. His name, Caesar Augustus, became the title of his successors. We still live in the calendar he reformed. We still use his name. Months named after him have not changed in 2,000 years. The word emperor itself derives from the Latin imperator, a title of military command. The word Tsar, the word Kaiser, they are both derived from Caesar. Every ruler who used those titles was claiming lineage from a man who was born Gaius Octavius in 63 before the Common Era in a perfectly ordinary Italian town. Not bad for a sickly 19-year-old who inherited a name. The Julio Claudians, Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, and Nero. The dynasty that Augustus founded, the Julio Claudians, combining his own Julian family line with the Claudian line through his wife Livia, ruled Rome for the next 54 years after his death, and the range of personalities involved is so extreme that it reads, to be honest, less like history and more like a Roman soap opera, written by someone who was told to make it as dramatic as possible, and decided there was no such thing as too dramatic. Tiberius, Augustus's successor, was a genuinely capable administrator and military commander who, by most accounts, found the job of emperor deeply unpleasant. He was reserved, suspicious, and eventually so disgusted by the sycophancy and political manipulation of the court that he moved to the island of Capri around 26 of the Common Era and effectively governed the empire from there for the last decade of his reign. He left the management of Rome increasingly to his Praetorian prefect, a man named Sejanus, who built a network of power so extensive that he was apparently planning to seize control entirely before Tiberius had him arrested and executed in 31. The Senate, which had been currying Sejanus's favour for years, then fell over itself, condemning him. Tiberius reportedly watched the spectacle with contempt. He died in 37 on Capri and was not mourned. His successor was his great-nephew Caligula, Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, called Caligula, Little Boot, from his childhood spent in military camps wearing a miniature legionary uniform, and the early months of his reign were popular and promising enough to give everyone hope. Then Caligula became ill in late 37 and recovered from the illness into what seems to have been a significantly different mental state. What exactly happened is debated. Ancient sources are lurid and unreliable on the subject, but the remaining 3.5 years of his reign were by any account a disaster. He spent money lavishly, treated the Senate with contempt, held what appeared to be genuine beliefs about his own divinity, and was eventually assassinated in 41 by officers of the Praetorian Guard who had personal grudges against him and general reasons besides. The Praetorian Guard, looking for the next emperor rather than allow the Senate to restore the Republic, found Augustus's uncle Claudius hiding behind a curtain in the palace, according to the famous story, and declared him emperor essentially on the spot. Claudius was physically awkward, stammered, and had been largely excluded from public life by Augustus and Tiberius as an embarrassment. He turned out to be a more capable ruler than almost anyone expected. He personally commanded the invasion of Britain in 43 of the Common Era, bringing the island into the empire, and he was a genuine scholar of Roman history and the Etruscan language. He was also, according to ancient sources, disastrously influenced by his wives. His third wife Messalina apparently used her position to settle personal scores on a spectacular scale, and his fourth wife, Agrippina the Younger, whom he married after executing Messalina, is widely suspected of having poisoned him in 54 to place her own son on the throne. That son was Nero. Nero began his reign well, under the guidance of his tutor Seneca, the Stoic philosopher, who wrote enormously influential works while managing an emperor, a balance of responsibilities that must have required some creative compartmentalization. The early years of Nero's reign were apparently reasonably administered, and then the guidance wore off, or Nero's own character asserted itself, and what followed was a reign that has fixed itself in the Western imagination as the archetype of imperial decadence and cruelty. The fire of Rome in 64 of the Common Era destroyed much of the city. Nero was at his villa in Antium when it started, not playing the fiddle, which had not yet been invented, but possibly the lyre, and the legend that he started the fire himself to clear land for his enormous new palace, the Domus Aurea, is almost certainly false. What is true is that he used Christians as scapegoats for the fire, and the persecution of Christians in Rome that followed was genuinely savage. He killed his mother. He may have kicked his pregnant wife to death. He executed Seneca by forcing him to open his veins, and Seneca, characteristically, spent his dying hours dictating philosophical reflections to secretaries. He put on theatrical performances and competed as an actor and charioteer, which the Roman aristocracy found more undignified than the killings, which tells you something about Roman aristocratic values. He was overthrown in 68 when provincial governors revolted, and killed himself with the help of a freedman who held the blade while Nero provided the push, reportedly saying, "What an artist dies in me," a line that has been used to satirize pompous self-regard ever since. With Nero, the Julio-Claudian dynasty ended. What followed was one of the most turbulent years in Roman history, and the proof that the system Augustus had built was, for all its achievements, sitting on a very unstable foundation. Daily life in Rome. What it actually felt like to be Roman. We have spent considerable time among emperors and generals, and it is time to come down from the heights and ask what life actually felt like for the people who made up the city of Rome. Not the people who poisoned relatives for political advantage, though those people had daily lives too, but the farmers and shopkeepers and bakers and freedmen and free poor who made up the overwhelming majority of the Roman world. Rome at its height was a city of approximately 1 million people. 1 million people on 7 hills and the surrounding plains, packed into a density that modern Romans would find claustrophobic, even by contemporary Italian standards. And modern Romans are not exactly known for their spacious apartments. Most Romans did not live in houses. They lived in insulae, apartment blocks of 4 to 6 stories built of concrete and brick, lining the streets in dense grids. The higher you lived, the cheaper the rent and the worse the conditions. Ground floor apartments had decent ventilation and easy access to the street. The top floors were cramped, dark, and in constant danger of fire, since heating and cooking were done with open braziers. Augustus eventually established the Vigiles, a combination fire brigade and night watch, partly in response to this perpetual danger. Roman landlords were apparently just as attentive to safety concerns as some modern ones. Apartment dwellers mostly ate out, buying food from street stalls and thermopolia. essentially ancient fast food counters with sunken pots in stone keeping food warm. Pompeii, preserved under volcanic ash from Vesuvius's eruption in 79 of the Common Era, gives us an extraordinary picture of this world. Wheel ruts still cut into the stone streets, stepping stones cross roads that doubled as open sewers. Election graffiti covers the walls alongside advertisements for gladiatorial games. Pompeii was a medium-sized provincial town, considerably more modest than Rome, but it provides a texture of daily life that no literary source can quite match. Rome itself was narrow, crowded, and loud. The city banned wheeled traffic during the day, so nights were filled with the rumble of delivery carts. Days were filled with shouting, hammering, street vendors, smithies, bakers. Rome smelled powerfully of the million people who occupied it, cooking food, animals, and the accumulated effluvia of daily life, somewhat mitigated in wealthier neighbourhoods by incense and the constant sound of flowing fountain water. What people ate depended entirely on what they could afford. The poor ate grain in various forms, bread, porridge, flat cakes, supplemented with olives, vegetables, and occasionally cheap fish. Garum, the fermented fish sauce Romans used the way modern Italians use salt, was ubiquitous across all classes. It was made by fermenting fish in salt over months, and was apparently delicious, which is something you simply have to take on faith. Meat was expensive and relatively rare. Wine was universal, diluted with water, considered an absolute basic of civilized life. Drinking it undiluted was considered barbaric, an opinion that has not survived into modern times. The baths deserve a moment. The thermae were not merely places to get clean, they were social centres, places to exercise, meet friends, conduct business, read, gossip, be seen. The great imperial baths could hold thousands of bathers simultaneously. Admission was cheap or free. They were one of the genuinely democratic institutions of Roman life, where a senator and a freedman might share the same steam room, though presumably not the same conversation. Roman family life was formally patriarchal, the paterfamilias holding powers that look extreme by modern standards. In practice, letters that have survived, from Cicero, from Pompeii, from the wooden tablets found at Vindolanda in Britain, show people who loved each other, worried about each other, and argued in perfectly recognizable ways. Human nature, it turns out, has not changed much in 2,000 years. Even in the furthest province, if you were a Roman citizen, you were part of something recognizable. The same calendar, the same coins, the same legal system, the same gods, more or less, the same garum. There was a Roman way of life that stretched from Hadrian's Wall to the Euphrates, and for most of the people living inside it, for most of the time, it was ordinary and functional and not particularly dramatic, which is exactly what most people want from civilization. Roman engineering, roads, aqueducts, and concrete. If you have ever driven on a road that runs in a perfectly straight line for mile after mile, seemingly indifferent to the topography, in its determination to go from point A to point B by the shortest possible route, you have experienced a road built on Roman principles. And if you have ever used a calendar, or attended a court of law, or lived in a city with a planned street grid, or benefited from a public water supply, or found yourself speaking a language derived from Latin, which means French, Italian, Spanish, Portuguese, Romanian, and significant portions of English, you have experienced Roman engineering in a broader sense. Rome's material achievements were enormous, and they were built to last. That they did last, that we can still walk on Roman roads in Britain, stand in Roman theatres in North Africa, and see the Pantheon in Rome essentially intact after nearly 2,000 years, is not an accident. The Romans understood that infrastructure was a form of power, that roads and bridges and water systems were as important to empire as armies, and they built accordingly. The roads come first, because they were literally how the empire was held together. The Roman road network at its greatest extent covered perhaps 77,000 kilometres of primary roads, plus many more of secondary roads. Roads connected Rome to every province, allowed the rapid movement of armies, facilitated commerce, enabled the cursus publicus, the imperial postal and communication system, and projected Roman authority into the landscape in a way that was almost as impressive as a legion. The road said, "Rome has been here. Rome intends to stay." Roman roads were not simply packed earth, they were engineered structures. A typical road was built in layers, a foundation layer of large flat stones, then smaller stones or gravel, then sand, and finally a surface of fitted stone blocks or gravel, depending on the location and the importance of the road. They were cambered, slightly higher in the centre, so that rainwater drained to the sides. They were wide enough for 2 carts to pass. They had milestones every Roman mile, just under 1,500 metres, showing the distance to Rome and the name of the official responsible for the road's maintenance. Roman milestones are still found across the former empire, still legible, still pointing the way. The most famous Roman road, the Appian Way, was begun in 312 before the Common Era and ran south from Rome to Brindisi, the port for crossing to Greece. Its surface of large, fitted basalt blocks has survived so well in places that you can still walk on the original road surface. Crassus, after suppressing Spartacus's slave revolt in 71 before the Common Era, crucified 6,000 captured slaves along the Appian Way from Capua to Rome, a distance of about 200 kilometres. The spacing would have been regular, 1 cross every 35 metres or so for miles and miles. Rome used infrastructure to communicate messages of power, and not all of those messages were gentle. The aqueducts are the engineering achievement that impresses people most immediately, partly because they are so visually dramatic and partly because the concept, bringing water from distant mountains to a city through a system of channels that maintains a precisely calculated gradient over many kilometres, is genuinely remarkable even by modern standards. Rome had 11 major aqueducts by the time of the early empire, supplying approximately 1 million cubic metres of water per day to a city of 1 million people, roughly 1,000 litres per person per day, which is more than most modern European cities supply. Most of this water was used for the public baths, the public fountains, and the management of the city's drainage and sewage system. A smaller but still substantial portion supplied private homes and the many industrial uses, fulling mills, bakeries, laundries, that required flowing water. The aqueducts were gravity-fed, no pumps. The source was higher than the destination, and the channel maintained a shallow downward gradient, sometimes just a few centimetres per kilometre, that kept the water moving without running so fast that it eroded the channel. Maintaining this gradient over tens of kilometres, often across uneven terrain, through tunnels bored through hills and over arched bridges spanning valleys, was a feat of surveying and engineering that modern engineers look at with considerable respect. The engineers did not have GPS or electronic surveying equipment. They had the Groma, a simple cross-shaped surveying instrument, and the water level, a horizontal tube of water, and very careful observation. They built the Pont de Garde in France, 50 metres high and nearly 300 metres long, still standing nearly 2,000 years later, and they built dozens of structures like it across the empire. The aqueduct water reached the city through a castellum aquae, a distribution tank, from which lead or ceramic pipes carried it to fountains, baths, and private connections. The lead pipes have given historians some concern since lead is toxic, but the continuous flow of water through the pipes apparently prevented the buildup of lead compounds that would make the water dangerous, and most Romans collected their water from the public fountains rather than from private pipes in any case. And then there is concrete. Roman concrete, opus caementitium, is one of the great materials revolutions of the ancient world, and its story is still unfolding because modern materials scientists are still studying it. Roman concrete was made from volcanic ash called pozzolana, found naturally near Rome and in other volcanic regions, mixed with lime and water to produce a material that hardened remarkably well even underwater. The Pantheon in Rome, completed around 125 of the Common Era, has an unreinforced concrete dome 43 metres in diameter, the largest unreinforced concrete dome in the world, that has stood for almost 2,000 years without the steel reinforcement that modern concrete construction routinely uses. Roman concrete seawater structures that have been studied in recent decades appear to actually become stronger over time as seawater minerals fill in microscopic gaps, which is the opposite of what modern concrete does. Materials scientists are studying this actively, because understanding it might have real applications for modern construction. The concrete allowed Romans to build on a scale, and with a flexibility that stone construction alone would not have permitted. The great vaults and domes of Roman architecture, the Pantheon, the imperial baths, the basilicas, would not have been possible without it. And these buildings were not only engineering achievements, they were statements. They communicated permanence, power, and the ambition of a civilization that expected to last. Hadrian's Wall, stretching 117 kilometres across northern Britain from the Solway Firth to the Tyne, built in the early 2nd century of the Common Era, is perhaps the most evocative single monument to Roman engineering in the world. It was not purely defensive. Walls do not stop determined attackers, and the Romans knew it. It was a control mechanism, a statement of where Roman territory ended and an infrastructure project that brought garrisons, roads, and trading posts to a frontier region. You could argue about its military logic indefinitely. As a declaration of intent and presence, it was unmistakable. Stand on Hadrian's Wall on a cold day, with the wind coming in off the moors and the grey sky pressing down, and look out to the north. This was the edge of the known world as far as Rome's ambition ran. To the south, roads led all the way to Rome itself. To the north, uncertainty. The Romans built a stone wall at the edge of their certainty, and it is still there. The Roman army, the machine that built the world. There is an argument, and it is not a frivolous one, that the most important institution Rome ever created was neither the Senate nor the laws nor the aqueducts, but the army. Everything else depended on the army. The provinces that paid the taxes that funded the administration were acquired and held by the army. The roads that connected the empire were built by the army. The emperors who commanded the political system were fundamentally the men who controlled the armies. The army was not merely the instrument of Roman power, it was in a very real sense the engine that generated Roman power. The Roman army of the classical period, the legion, just was organised with a systematic efficiency that no other force in the ancient world could match. A legion at full strength consisted of approximately 5,400 men, divided into 10 cohorts, each cohort into 6 centuries of roughly 80 men commanded by a centurion. The centurions were the backbone of the legion, professional soldiers who had worked their way up through the ranks, who were responsible for training, discipline, and the immediate command in battle. A good centurion was one of the most valuable officers in the army. The senior centurion of a legion, the primus pilus, first spear, had a position of enormous prestige. The legionaries were heavily equipped. They carried a large curved rectangular shield, the scutum. They wore plate armour or chainmail, a helmet, and carried 2 heavy javelins, the pilum, designed to be thrown just before close combat. The shaft was weighted and slightly flexible at the point of joining, so that when the pilum struck a shield it bent, becoming impossible to throw back and making the shield awkward to use. They then fought with the gladius, a short stabbing sword in tight formation. The Roman way of war was close, brutal, and extremely organised. Legionaries did not only fight, they dug. Every night when the legion made camp, it dug a rectangular camp, surrounded by a ditch and bank and a wooden palisade. Every night, regardless of whether the enemy was nearby. This was the rule. This habit meant that a Roman army was never without a defensible base of operations, no matter what the circumstances, and it also meant that the digging skills that built camps on campaign built walls, roads, and aqueducts in more settled times. The Roman soldier was an engineer as much as a fighter. Supporting the legions were the auxiliary troops, non-citizen soldiers drawn from the provinces who served alongside the legions in specialised roles. Cavalry from Spain and the Danube frontier, archers from Syria, slingers from the Balearic Islands, light infantry from various provinces. The auxiliaries were as numerous as the legionaries and no less important. When auxiliary soldiers completed their service and were discharged, they received Roman citizenship. The army was one of the most powerful tools of Romanization the empire possessed, producing generation after generation of men from Gaul and Britain and Syria and North Africa, who had served alongside Romans, learned Latin, absorbed Roman culture, and emerged as citizens. Service in the legions was a 25-year commitment, and it was not glamorous. Soldiers were subject to iron discipline. The tradition of decimation, executing every 10th man of a disgraced unit, was apparently still used occasionally in the early empire, though rarely. Ordinary punishments involved flogging, extra duties, and reduction in pay or rations. Pay was modest by the standards of the wealthy, generous by the standards of a peasant, and supplemented by donatives, cash gifts from emperors on occasions like their accession, and by the share of campaign plunder that came to the successful legionary. The food was serviceable. Grain in various forms, bread, porridge, hardtack, formed the basis of the military diet, supplemented with legumes, olive oil, cheese, and whatever could be obtained locally or looted from the enemy. Garum appeared everywhere, including military contexts, since it was an efficient way to add flavour and some nutrition to otherwise plain food. Roman soldiers complained about their rations in letters home, just as soldiers have complained about their food in every army in every era, suggesting that human nature in this respect has not changed materially in 2,000 years. The psychological effect of a Roman army on its opponents was itself a military tool. The sight of ordered ranks of men moving in precise formation, the noise of shields being struck rhythmically with swords before battle, the engineering works that appeared overnight around any position the Romans wanted. These communicated something that went beyond numerical strength. They communicated an organization, a patience, a collective will that many opponents found more frightening than individual Roman soldiers. This is not to say the Roman army was invincible. It manifestly was not. The defeat at the Teutoburg Forest in 9 of the Common Era, where 3 Roman legions under Publius Quinctilius Verus were annihilated in an ambush by Germanic tribes led by a man named Arminius, who had himself served in the Roman army and knew exactly how it operated, was a catastrophe that stopped Rome's advance into Germany permanently. Augustus reportedly wandered his palace beating his head against the walls and crying out, "Varus, give me back my legions." The legions were not given back. Germany east of the Rhine remained outside the empire, but losses of this kind, though painful, did not generally destroy Roman strategic power. The system rebuilt, new legions were raised, the loss was absorbed. The permanence of the institution outlasted the destruction of its individual units. That institutional permanence, the continuity of a professional army as a state institution rather than a feudal levy or a personal following, is one of Rome's most important contributions to the subsequent history of warfare and of states. Bread and circuses, entertainment, gladiators, and the Colosseum. The satirist Juvenal, writing in the late 1st and early 2nd century of the Common Era, complained that the Roman people had traded their civic virtue for bread and circuses, panem et circenses. They no longer cared about politics or governance. Give them free grain and entertaining spectacles, and they would leave you alone to run the empire as you liked. Juvenal was being satirical rather than descriptive. The reality was more complicated. But the phrase has survived because it identifies something real about how the Roman imperial system managed its population, and because it is the kind of elegant complaint that appeals to people who feel superior to the entertainments their contemporaries enjoy. The grain dole, the annona, was a Roman institution that predated the empire. From the time of the Gracchi onward, the Roman state had increasingly subsidized or provided free grain to the citizen population of Rome. By the imperial period, a substantial portion of the city's population received a monthly grain ration from the state. This was not charity in any modern sense of the term. It was a political calculation, an acknowledgement that keeping Rome's population fed was a state responsibility, and that hungry urban populations were politically dangerous. Egypt was the empire's grain basket, and ensuring the reliable shipment of Egyptian grain to Rome was one of the emperor's most fundamental obligations. The spectacles were organized on a similarly systematic basis. The Roman calendar was full of public holidays. By the late empire, there were well over 100 days a year of public games of various kinds. Games could mean chariot racing at the Circus Maximus, theatrical performances, gladiatorial combat, animal hunts in the arena, or public executions that took the form of spectacle. All of this was funded by the state, or by wealthy individuals, emperors, ambitious politicians, who understood that funding public entertainment brought goodwill. The Circus Maximus, the great chariot racing stadium that occupied the valley between the Palatine and Aventine hills, could hold approximately 250,000 spectators. This is not a typo. 250,000 people watching 4-horse chariot teams race around a central barrier, with all the noise and excitement and violence of a sport where crashes were frequent and sometimes fatal. Romans were divided by colour, the greens, blues, reds and whites, and the intensity of partisan support for racing teams in Rome would not have seemed out of place at a modern football stadium. Emperors who backed the winning faction were popular. Emperors who backed the losing faction heard about it. Gladiatorial combat is the entertainment most associated with Rome in the modern imagination, and it was genuinely important to Roman culture even if modern films tend to exaggerate both the scale and the inevitability of death in the arena. Gladiators were, for the most part, professionals, slaves or criminals or volunteers who had been trained at specialized schools, the ludi, in specific fighting styles. The different gladiatorial types, the heavily armoured Samnite, the net and trident-wielding Retiarius, the fish-scale armoured Murmillo, were matched against each other with an eye to spectacle and contrast. Death was not the automatic outcome of a gladiatorial match. A skilled gladiator represented a significant investment of training and resources, and killing them was wasteful. A defeated gladiator would often appeal to the crowd and to the presiding official, the editor, the person funding the games, for mercy. Whether mercy was granted depended on the crowd's response and the editor's decision. The famous thumbs up or thumbs down of modern imagination is not accurate. The actual signal was probably either a raised or pointed thumb to indicate killing, and a closed or withdrawn thumb to indicate mercy, though the exact gestures are debated. What is not debated is that the crowd participated actively in these decisions, which was part of the social function of the games. They gave the Roman population a collective voice in matters of life and death, a kind of democratic theatre even in the most autocratic periods of the empire. The Colosseum, officially the Flavian amphitheatre named for the dynasty that built it, was dedicated in 80 of the Common Era under the Emperor Titus, and it is the most recognisable building in Rome today, and arguably the most recognisable ancient building in the world. It could hold between 50,000 and 80,000 spectators, seated by social class, senators in the front rows, equestrians behind them, ordinary citizens higher up, women and slaves and the poor at the very top. It had a sophisticated velarium, a retractable awning system operated by sailors, to shade spectators from the sun. It had 80 numbered entrances organised so that the entire audience could be seated and evacuated efficiently. It had a subterranean network of tunnels and elevators, operated by counterweights and winches, that could deliver animals, gladiators and scenery to the arena floor. It was, as an event venue, genuinely impressive by any era's standards. It was built on the former site of a decorative lake in Nero's private palace complex, the Domus Aurea, and this was not an accident. Vespasian and Titus, the Flavian emperors who built it, were making a very specific political statement. The land the tyrant Nero stole from the people is being returned to the people as a gift of entertainment, public space, reclaimed from private indulgence. The architecture was political communication. The animals hunted in the arena, the venations, represented both the wealth of the empire and its reach. Lions from North Africa, bears from the Balkans, crocodiles from the Nile, elephants, rhinoceroses, hippos, exotic big cats from the east. Thousands of animals were shipped to Rome for these events over centuries, with measurable ecological impact on the populations of various species in various regions. The North African lion, for example, was driven to extinction at least partly through hunting for Roman arena spectacles. These entertainments were not without their critics. Stoic philosophers found the gladiatorial combats morally objectionable. Seneca, who attended the arena and was disturbed by what he saw there, wrote about the way exposure to casual killing coarsened the spectators. Pliny the Younger expressed distaste. But these were minority voices in a culture that found the games not merely acceptable, but genuinely exciting and socially important. The games were one of the places where Rome happened as a collective experience, where hundreds of thousands of people shared emotion, exerted collective will, and felt themselves to be part of something larger. That social function was real, whatever one might think of the content. The year of the 4 emperors and the Flavian dynasty. When Nero killed himself in 68 of the Common Era, he ended not just his own reign, but a dynasty. The Julio-Claudians were finished, and Rome had never faced before the question of who came next when there was no obvious dynastic successor. The answer, as it turned out, was chaos, and then the army. In quick succession in 68 and 69, a period so compressed and violent that it became known as the Year of the 4 Emperors, the empire was claimed by 4 different men, 3 of whom died violently before the year was out. Galba, a stern elderly senator and provincial governor, was declared emperor by the Senate when Nero's position collapsed, and arrived in Rome with such a reputation for severity and financial tightness that his Praetorian Guard, who expected a generous donative and received only the remark that it was his habit to levy troops not buy them, murdered him in the Forum within 7 months. Otho, who had helped organise Galba's accession and then been passed over for succession, was declared emperor by the Praetorian Guard the same day Galba was murdered. His reign lasted 95 days before the legions of the Rhine frontier, who had declared their commander Vitellius emperor before Galba even died, marched into Italy and defeated Otho's forces. Otho killed himself, reportedly to spare his supporters further suffering, and is remembered as the only Julio-Claudian period emperor who died in a way that seemed genuinely admirable. Vitellius reigned for about 8 months and is remembered by ancient sources, which were not well disposed toward him, primarily for his gluttony and his administrative incompetence, though the ancient sources are not entirely reliable on either point. While Vitellius was eating Rome out of house and home, the legions of the East had declared their own candidate, Titus Flavius Vespasianus, the general in command of the suppression of the Jewish revolt in Judea. Vespasian was everything Vitellius was not: experienced, disciplined, administratively capable, and possessed of a dry sense of humour that became legendary. His forces took Rome, Vitellius was killed, and the Flavian dynasty began. Vespasian governed for 10 years in a manner that the Roman world found, after the excesses of Nero and the chaos of 69, profoundly reassuring. He was blunt, unpretentious, and genuinely funny. When flatterers sought to trace his ancestry to the gods like the Julio-Claudians, he reportedly found this so absurd that he laughed at it openly. He restocked the treasury that Nero had drained, enforced taxes efficiently. There is a famous story that when his son Titus objected to a tax on public urinals, as Rome collected and sold urine for use in fulling wool, Vespasian held a coin under Titus's nose and asked whether it smelled. Titus admitted it did not. Vespasian reportedly said, "And yet it comes from urine," giving us a Latin phrase, pecunia non olet, money does not smell, that is still used today. He began the Colosseum. He died in 79 of the Common Era, and his last recorded words were that he thought he was becoming a god, a reference to the Roman custom of posthumous deification that made clear he found the whole thing slightly absurd. He was. His son Titus succeeded him, completed and dedicated the Colosseum, and ruled for only 2 years before dying of fever in 81. But those 2 years included the eruption of Vesuvius in 79, one of the great natural disasters of the ancient world, which buried Pompeii, Herculaneum, and surrounding towns under ashen pumice, killing thousands, and a catastrophic fire in Rome, and a plague. Titus was remembered as a good emperor partly because he died before he had time to become a bad one, which ancient sources note with their characteristic honesty. His brother Domitian, who followed, was one of those emperors about whom ancient and modern assessments diverge sharply. The senatorial sources, Tacitus, Pliny the Younger, Suetonius, portray him as a paranoid tyrant who terrorized the Senate, executed senators on spurious charges, and demanded to be addressed as Dominus et Deus, Lord and God, during his lifetime. Modern historians note that his administrative record was actually fairly competent, his military achievements real, and that his bad reputation was largely constructed by senatorial writers who had every reason to paint him darkly. Both things can be true. He was probably genuinely difficult to work for and genuinely competent at governance. He was assassinated in 96 by a court conspiracy that included, reportedly, his own wife, and the Senate's reaction to his death was to tear down his statues with considerable enthusiasm. The Flavian dynasty ended with Domitian, but it had restored stability after 69, built the Colosseum, and produced the Arch of Titus, still standing in Rome, showing the spoils of the Jewish war, including the great menorah from the temple in Jerusalem, being carried in triumph. That arch has been there for nearly 2,000 years, and Jewish visitors to Rome have, by tradition, walked around it rather than under it. After Domitian, the Senate chose its own successor, an elderly senator named Nerva, who recognized immediately that he needed military backing and adopted as his heir a successful general from Spain named Trajan. This was the beginning of something that the 18th century historian Edward Gibbon would call the period in the history of the world during which the condition of the human race was most happy and prosperous. He was probably overstating it, but the era he was describing was genuinely remarkable. The 5 good emperors, Rome at its height Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, Marcus Aurelius. These 5 emperors ruled Rome consecutively from 96 to 180 of the Common Era, and the period is remembered as the height of Roman imperial civilization. It is sometimes called the era of the 5 good emperors, a phrase that contains a certain dark implication, that there were quite a lot of bad ones, but that accurately captures the sustained quality of governance that Rome experienced during these 84 years. The system that held during this period was adoption. Each emperor, lacking a suitable natural son, chose his successor on the basis of ability and adopted him as his son. Gibbon described this as placing the welfare of millions in the hands of men selected for their merits. It worked, as long as the reigning emperor was both wise enough to choose well and lucky enough not to have a natural son who demanded to inherit. The system collapsed immediately when Marcus Aurelius broke the pattern by allowing his natural son Commodus to succeed him. Commodus was not good. Trajan, who ruled from 98 to 117, was perhaps the most militarily successful of the 5. He extended the empire to its greatest geographic extent, conquering Dacia, modern Romania, in 2 great campaigns that are documented in detail on Trajan's column. a 100-metre-high marble column in Rome whose continuous spiral frieze illustrates the campaigns with remarkable detail. He's still one of the only Roman emperors with a column in the centre of Rome that stands intact, and it is still possible to go and look at the Roman soldiers building camps and crossing rivers and fighting battles that Trajan led 1800 years ago. He also campaigned in the east, taking parts of Armenia and Mesopotamia from the Parthians, reaching the Persian Gulf, and reportedly looking out at the sea and lamenting that he was too old to follow in Alexander's footsteps to India. He died on the journey home. Hadrian, who followed, was a very different kind of man. Where Trajan expanded, Hadrian consolidated. He recognized that the territories taken by Trajan in the east were indefensible. They were too far from Rome's center of gravity, too easily attacked, and not worth the resources required to hold them, and gave most of them back, which made him somewhat unpopular, but was probably the right strategic decision. He was an extraordinary personality, intellectually omnivorous, interested in architecture, poetry, Greek philosophy, and the cultures of every province he visited, and he visited most of them personally. He spent much of his reign touring the empire, inspecting its frontiers and administration, and his tours gave us both Hadrian's Wall in Britain and the extraordinary Villa Adriana near Tivoli outside Rome, where he recreated architectural memories of the places he had visited, a Canopus Canal from Egypt, a Stoa from Athens, Greek temples, Egyptian temples, all arranged in a personal landscape of extraordinary sophistication. He had a profound and publicly acknowledged love for a young Greek man named Antinous, whose death by drowning in the Nile in 130 led to Hadrian's founding an Egyptian city named after him and ordering his deification. Antinous was worshipped as a minor god in several provinces. Ancient sources are a little uncertain what to make of this. Modern readers are somewhat less uncertain. Antoninus Pius, the most peaceable of the five, who earned his surname for persuading the Senate to deify Hadrian, which they had been reluctant to do, had the longest reign, from 138 to 161, and the most uneventful. There were no major wars, no major crises, no significant disasters. He ran the empire efficiently from Rome and almost never left Italy. His record has the slightly paradoxical quality of being praised precisely because nothing much went wrong, which is an underrated quality in a ruler and rarer than one might expect. Marcus Aurelius inherited an empire in better shape than almost any ruler in Roman history had received, and then spent most of his reign at war. The Parthians attacked in the east. The Germanic tribes crossed the Danube in the north. He fought and administered simultaneously, spending years on the Danube frontier, and during this time he wrote, "The Meditations of Marcus Aurelius is one of the most extraordinary documents that antiquity has left us, a private journal, never intended for publication, in which the emperor-philosopher worked through the Stoic philosophical tradition he had studied since youth. He wrote in Greek, not Latin. He wrote about duty and impermanence, about how to behave when circumstances are difficult, about how to find peace in a life of constant obligation, about death and the smallness of human ambition against the scale of time. You think about what you're going to do for several years and then you will not exist." The emperor who commanded the most powerful state in the Western world wrote about how little any of it ultimately mattered, and the combination of that power and that honesty produces something genuinely moving. He died in 180 at the military camp at Vindobona, modern Vienna, and was succeeded by his son Commodus. Commodus had his father's lineage and none of his wisdom. He renamed Rome and the Roman months and the legions after himself, appeared in the Colosseum dressed as Hercules to personally kill animals in the arena, and generally behaved in ways that suggested a man who had not been adequately challenged at any point in his upbringing. He was strangled in his bath by a wrestler named Narcissus, hired by a conspiracy including his own mistress in 192. The five good emperors had shown what Rome could be at its best: stable, expansive, intellectually serious, relatively humane. What followed was a reminder that institutions, however good, are only as stable as the human beings who operate them. Roman religion, philosophy, and the inner life. To understand ancient Rome fully, you have to understand something about how Romans experienced the world internally, what they believed, what they feared, what comforted them. The inner life of ancient Rome was considerably richer and stranger than the toga-clad marble statue version that tends to dominate the popular imagination. Roman religion in its original form was not about belief in the way that later Abrahamic religions use that concept. You did not need to believe in Jupiter or Juno or Mars in any personal or spiritual sense. What you needed to do was perform the correct rituals at the correct times. The relationship between Romans and their gods was essentially contractual. The Latin phrase was "do ut des," I give so that you may give. You offered sacrifice, observed the sacred days, performed the rituals correctly, and in exchange the gods were expected to look favourably on your endeavours. This was religion as civic obligation more than personal faith. Less a conversion experience, more a maintenance schedule. The Roman pantheon was not a closed system. Rome had a remarkably open approach to foreign gods. If a new deity seemed genuinely powerful, adopting them seemed wiser than ignoring them. Eastern mystery religions, offering personal initiation and promises about individual fate after death, proliferated from the Republic onward. The cult of Isis from Egypt established permanent communities in Rome. The cult of Mithras spread through the army and left temples across the entire empire. The cult of Cybele, the Great Mother from Asia Minor, involved rituals so dramatically un-Roman, including the self-castration of its male priests, that the Roman state tried for years to prevent citizens from joining it. They joined it anyway. Romans were ultimately impossible to stop when they had made up their minds about a religion. Philosophy in Rome was primarily practical. Romans were happy to import Greek philosophy wholesale, and then apply it directly to the question of how to live. The dominant school was Stoicism, which taught that virtue was the only true good, that external circumstances were ultimately indifferent, and that the wise person maintained inner tranquility regardless of what fortune delivered. This was extraordinarily well suited to Roman public life. It gave you a framework for enduring military disasters, political reversals, exile, and death with dignity. It was the tradition of Marcus Aurelius, Seneca, and Epictetus, whose works remain in print and in use today, which is a remarkable survival record for any philosophy. Epicureanism, which identified calm contentment rather than wild indulgence as the highest good, also had its followers. The Epicureans advocated withdrawing from public life and living quietly, which was not a recipe for Roman political success but produced some of the finest Roman poetry. Lucretius's De Rerum Natura, on the nature of things, argued that the universe is composed of atoms moving through void, that the soul dissolves at death, and that religion causes more fear than comfort. Nothing about this argument is structurally different from modern materialist philosophy. Lucretius got there 2,000 years early and wrote it in some of the most beautiful Latin verse ever produced. He was also, by most accounts, deeply unhappy. Philosophers often are. Roman tombstones across the empire reveal a range of attitudes toward death, from calm acceptance to evident terror. The phrase non fui, non sum, non curo, I was not, I was, I am not, I care not, appears on many graves. An Epicurean shrug at mortality that has its own bleak comfort. The intellectual life of Rome produced a literature that has never gone out of circulation. Virgil, Horace, Ovid, Cicero, Tacitus, Seneca, read continuously for 2,000 years, translated into every European language, studied, imitated and quarried for quotations by medieval writers, Renaissance humanists and Enlightenment philosophers alike. To be educated in the Western tradition for most of its history was to think in categories that Romans had thought in first. That is a form of immortality Cicero would have appreciated, even if it came slightly too late to prevent him from being stabbed on the Appian Way. The rise of Christianity. Inside the empire. In the reign of the Emperor Tiberius, in a peripheral province of the Eastern Empire, a Jewish preacher from Galilee named Jesus was crucified by the Roman prefect Pontius Pilate on what appears to have been a charge of sedition, the claim that he was king of the Jews, which the Romans would have interpreted as a political threat in a region already prone to revolt. This was an ordinary Roman execution of the kind that happened hundreds of times a year across the empire. The man was a minor provincial figure whose followers were few. No Roman administrator of the period thought it worth recording in any detail. Within 3 centuries, the religion founded in response to this execution was the official religion of the Roman Empire. The trajectory from that execution to Constantine's conversion is one of the most dramatic stories in the history of civilization, and it happened inside Roman structures even as it eventually transformed them. Early Christianity spread through the Roman world along Roman roads, using Roman communications in the Roman language of Greek in the east and Latin in the west, through the Roman network of cities that connected the empire. Paul of Tarsus, a Roman citizen, which mattered practically for his missionary travels, moved through the empire using the infrastructure Rome had built, writing letters to communities in Roman cities, thinking in Greek philosophical categories, even as he proclaimed a thoroughly Jewish theological vision. The early Christians were not universally persecuted, despite what later Christian memory sometimes suggested. Roman religion was extraordinarily tolerant of diversity, and Rome's general policy was to leave religious communities alone as long as they performed their civic and religious obligations to the state. The problem with Christians, from the Roman perspective, was that they would not sacrifice to the gods and would not worship the divine emperors. This was not, to Romanize, a matter of private religious belief. It was a refusal to perform civic duty, a kind of subversive withdrawal from the shared obligations that held Roman society together. It also had a whiff of the un-Roman about it. Romans noticed that Christians rejected the traditional gods, worshipped a criminal who had been executed, refused to eat meat that had been sacrificed to the gods, and met in private, which the Roman imagination immediately associated with conspiracy. Persecutions of Christians occurred. Nero's persecution in 64 is the most famous early example, but there were others, more or less systematic, more or less severe, in different parts of the empire at different times. The great persecution under Diocletian beginning in 303 was the most sustained and violent, aimed explicitly at destroying Christianity as an organized movement. It failed, partly because of the stubborn refusal of Christians to recant even under torture and the peculiar social effect that martyrdom had. The early Christian writer Tertullian said the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church, and there is evidence this was practically true. Christianity survived persecution partly through its organizational strength. The network of bishops in city after city created an institution with genuine resilience, and partly through the content of its message, which offered things that Roman state religion and even the philosophy schools could not quite offer. Personal salvation, a direct relationship with the divine that did not depend on wealth or status, equality before God that sat oddly alongside Roman social hierarchy, but was nevertheless deeply appealing, care for the poor and sick as a religious obligation, the promise of bodily resurrection rather than the grey underworld of the Homeric tradition. These were genuinely new and genuinely compelling ideas in the Roman religious marketplace, and they found an audience. The decisive moment was when the Emperor Constantine, in 312 of the Common Era, before the Battle of Milvian Bridge, had what he described as a vision, either of the cross or of a solar symbol, accounts differ, and attributed his victory in the battle to the Christian God. His subsequent support for Christianity, legalizing it through the Edict of Milan in 313, returning confiscated Christian property, favoring Christians in appointments, building churches in Rome and Constantinople, transformed the status of the religion from a tolerated minority cult to the emperor's preferred faith. Christianity did not immediately become the empire's official religion. That would wait for Theodosius in 380. But from Constantine onward, the direction was clear. The intellectual and institutional resources of the Roman world were progressively directed toward developing, defining, and enforcing Christian orthodoxy, a process that generated almost immediately the bitter theological controversies, Arianism, Donatism, and others, that would occupy the church councils of the 4th and 5th centuries. Rome's administrative genius was applied to organizing Christianity with the same systematic energy it brought to organizing everything else. The effect on Rome's institutions was as transformative as the effect on Christianity. Church and state intertwined in ways that would shape European civilization for 1,000 years. Bishops accumulated legal and civic as well as religious authority. Church councils began to function like governmental bodies. The Bishop of Rome claimed a primacy over other bishops that would eventually develop into the papacy, an institution that survived the fall of the Western Empire and continued to exercise authority for the next 1,500 years. The Roman Church, in fact, became one of the most important vehicles through which Roman institutions, Roman law, and Latin language were preserved and transmitted through the Middle Ages. That is a remarkable irony. The empire that persecuted Christianity for 2 centuries became, through the vehicle of Christianity, one of the primary mechanisms for transmitting Roman culture to the civilizations that followed. Crisis of the 3rd century, when everything fell apart. The 5 good emperors had shown what the Roman system could do at its best. The 3rd century showed what happened when the system was under sufficient pressure to reveal all its structural weaknesses simultaneously. The period from 235 to 284 of the Common Era, roughly 50 years, saw the Roman Empire come closer to total dissolution than at any point in its history before the actual fall. In those 5 decades, there were more than 50 men who claimed the title of emperor, most of whom ruled for less than a year and most of whom died violently. The armies of the Rhine, the Danube, and the East made and unmade emperors with a speed that made the political life of the late Republic look orderly by comparison. This period is not called the crisis of the 3rd century because historians like dramatic labels. It is called that because it was, by any reasonable measure, a crisis. The sources of the crisis were multiple and mutually reinforcing. Military pressure on the frontiers was increasing. The Germanic peoples north of the Rhine and Danube, the Goths, the Alemanni, the Franks and others, were becoming more organized, more capable, and more threatening. In the east, the Sassanid Persian Empire, which had replaced the Parthians in 224, was considerably more aggressive and militarily effective than its predecessor. In 260, the Emperor Valerian was captured in battle by the Sassanid king Shapur, the only Roman emperor to be taken prisoner by a foreign enemy, and died in captivity. Shapur reportedly used him as a mounting block when getting on his horse, which ancient sources report with the kind of resigned horror that suggests they found it as humiliating as it sounds. Multiple simultaneous threats required multiple armies in multiple places at the same time, led by capable generals who were trusted with large forces. Those generals, discovering their indispensability and their power, began to compete for the throne. The Praetorian Guard and the legions had always had significant influence over succession, but in the 3rd century this influence became so dominant that emperors were effectively the creatures of their armies, ruling only as long as their particular troops remained loyal, and no other general made a more compelling offer. The payoff to maintain this loyalty, donatives, bonuses, promises of land, was expensive, and the treasury was under severe strain from decades of military expenditure. Economic consequences followed. The silver content of Roman coins was steadily debased, reduced, over the century as the state tried to coin enough money to meet its obligations. Silver coins that had been 90% silver in the 2nd century were perhaps 2 to 5% silver by the 280s. This debasement produced inflation that eroded the purchasing power of everyone who received a fixed income, including soldiers, which created pressure for more pay increases, which required more debasement. The economic spiral was familiar to anyone who has studied inflationary crises in any era. Trade disrupted. Cities shrank behind newly built walls as the security that Rome had provided across its interior broke down. Parts of the empire effectively broke away. The Gallic Empire, covering Gaul, Britain and Spain, operated independently for about 15 years. The Palmyrene Empire in the east, led by the extraordinary Queen Zenobia, controlled Egypt and Syria for several years before being suppressed. The empire survived these breakaways, but only just. Plague added to the chaos. The Antonine Plague of the late 2nd century had already killed millions. The Plague of Cyprian, beginning around 249, was another severe outbreak, possibly smallpox, possibly measles, possibly something now extinct, that killed perhaps a third of the population in affected areas over the course of about 2 decades. The death toll was enormous. The psychological effect on a civilization that had begun to associate Christian apocalypticism with the end of the Roman order was also significant. And yet, the empire did not fall. Several capable military emperors, the so-called soldier emperors, held things together through sheer force of will and military competence. Claudius Gothicus in 268–270 drove back the Goths. Aurelian in 270–275 reunited the breakaway empires, drove back the Germanic invaders, and built the Aurelian Wall around Rome. The circuit of walls that still largely defines central Rome today, their existence being itself evidence of how drastically Rome's strategic situation had changed. Since earlier Rome had not needed walls because the threat was supposed to stop at the borders. The crisis ended not with a sudden victory but with a gradual stabilization, and the man most responsible for that stabilization was a remarkable figure who came to power in 284 and completely reimagined how the empire was organized and ruled. Diocletian, Constantine, and the empire reinvented. Gaius Aurelius Valerius Diocletianus, Diocletian, came from humble origins in what is now Croatia and rose through the military ranks to become emperor in 284. He ruled for 21 years and introduced changes to the structure of the Roman state so fundamental that what emerged from his reign was, in several important respects, a different kind of entity from what had entered it. His most important structural reform was the tetrarchy, the rule of 4. Recognizing that the empire was too large and its frontiers too long for a single ruler to manage, Diocletian divided supreme authority between 4 emperors, 2 senior emperors called Augusti and 2 junior emperors called Caesars, each responsible for a different part of the empire and each with their own court, army, and administration. The system was theoretically designed so that the Caesars would eventually succeed the Augusti, who would retire voluntarily, which Diocletian himself did in 305, becoming the only Roman emperor to voluntarily abdicate, and then spending his retirement growing cabbages at his palace in Split on the Dalmatian coast. When former colleagues urged him to return to power, he reportedly replied that if they could see the cabbages he had grown, they would not ask him to abandon them. The man had priorities. The Tetrarchy did not survive Diocletian's retirement. As soon as he was gone, the various emperors and their sons began competing for sole control, and Constantine, who was one of the claimants, eventually won. But many of Diocletian's other reforms did survive. He substantially expanded the imperial bureaucracy, creating new administrative layers between the emperor and the provinces. He reformed the tax system, attempting to put it on a more stable basis. He reorganized the army, increasing its size and modifying its structure. He separated civil from military authority in the provinces, which had been combined in the same person, and had created the conditions for every soldier emperor of the 3rd century. He attempted, through the Edict on Maximum Prices in 3.1, to control inflation, the world's oldest known attempt at price controls, which did not work particularly well since price controls almost never do. Constantine, who became sole emperor in 324 after defeating his last rival, continued and built on Diocletian's structural reforms while introducing one change so significant that it overshadows everything else: his support for Christianity, already discussed. He also moved the empire's capital. In 330 he refounded the old Greek city of Byzantium on the Bosphorus, the narrow strait between Europe and Asia, the strategic key to both the Black Sea and the Eastern Mediterranean, as Constantinople, the city of Constantine, the new Rome. The city was dedicated in 330 and would remain the capital of the Eastern Empire for over 1,000 years, until its fall to the Ottoman Turks in 1453. The relocation of the capital to the east has enormous significance in retrospect. It moved the centre of gravity of the empire away from Italy, away from the Latin West toward the Greek East. It reflected the reality that the East was wealthier, more urbanized, and more defensible than the West, facts that would become critically important as the 5th century approached. The Western Empire would eventually fall. The Eastern Empire, centred on Constantinople, would survive for another 1,000 years as what we now call the Byzantine Empire, a state that called itself Roman, used Roman law, spoke Greek rather than Latin, and preserved Roman institutions in a form that was genuinely continuous even as it evolved enormously. The empire of Diocletian and Constantine was visibly different from the empire of Augustus. The emperors were now surrounded by elaborate ceremony, drawn partly from the traditions of Eastern courts. Prostration before the emperor became expected. Rich robes and elaborate jewellery replaced the relatively modest dress of earlier emperors. The imperial cult was no longer a relatively restrained civic ceremony, but an elaborate theatrical performance. The state was more explicitly authoritarian, more overtly hierarchical, more bureaucratic. It was also, in some respects, more effective. The administrative reforms of Diocletian and Constantine gave the empire a more durable structure than the freewheeling system of the early Principate. It was also a state increasingly oriented around Christianity, a faith that, in the century and a half since Constantine, would transform from a minority cult to the organising principle of the empire's cultural, intellectual, and eventually political life. The Rome that had crucified a Jewish preacher in Judea had become, in an almost incomprehensibly ironic twist, the empire that organised and championed that preacher's religion. The fall of the Western Empire. The fall of Rome is the most famous collapse in Western history, and it is surrounded by so many myths, misconceptions, and dramatic simplifications that it is worth being very precise about what actually happened. The fall of Rome was not an event. It was a process. Long, complicated, and so gradual that most people living through it may not have fully recognised it for what it was. The Western Roman Empire is conventionally said to have fallen in 476, when a Germanic chieftain named Odoacer deposed the last Western emperor, a teenager named Romulus Augustulus, and sent the imperial insignia to Constantinople, with a message saying that the West no longer needed its own emperor. This date is real, and this event is real, but its significance was understood differently at the time than it is in retrospect. Romulus Augustulus was not recognized as legitimate by the Eastern Emperor in the first place. The Eastern Empire continued. Roman law continued. Roman cities continued. The Catholic Church, now deeply embedded in Roman institutions, continued. The date 476 marks the formal end of a political structure, not the end of Roman civilization. The process that produced that ending was long in development. The reforms of Diocletian and Constantine had stabilized the empire in the short term, but had also accelerated some of the trends that ultimately undermined the West. The bureaucracy was expensive, the military was expensive, the tax burden on the agricultural population was heavy and growing, and unlike in the era of the Great Conquests, there were no longer new territories being added that could be plundered or taxed to offset the costs. The empire had reached its natural limits and was now operating on what it already had, which was less dynamic than a system that was still expanding. The people commonly called barbarians, a Greek word meaning those who speak another language, not inherently derogatory in its original use, had been interacting with Rome for centuries. German warriors served in the Roman legions in large numbers. Barbarian leaders were given Roman titles and commands. The integration of Germanic peoples into Roman military structures had been going on for generations and was in many respects successful. These soldiers fought effectively for Rome and absorbed Roman culture in the process, but by the late 4th century the Germanic peoples on the northern frontier were themselves under pressure from a new force from the east, the Huns, a Central Asian nomadic people who swept into the Pontic steppe in the 370s and drove the Gothic peoples in their path into Roman territory. The Goths who crossed the Danube in 376 were not invaders in the traditional sense. They were refugees, asking for permission to settle in Roman territory. The Romans agreed, but the local administration of the settlement was so corrupt and brutal, Roman officials literally traded food for Goth children to enslave, that the Goths revolted. At the Battle of Adrianople in 378, the Gothic cavalry annihilated a Roman army and killed the Emperor Valens. It was a disaster comparable to Cannae, and it had similarly long-term consequences. From Adrianople onward, the Western Empire's ability to control its own territory deteriorated progressively. The Visigoths under Alaric sacked Rome in 410, the first time the city had been sacked in 800 years, an event that shocked the Roman world so deeply that St. Augustine began writing the City of God partly in response to pagans who blamed Rome's conversion to Christianity for the disaster. The sack lasted 3 days. It was not as destructive as later tellings sometimes suggest, and Alaric's Visigoths were actually Christian themselves, which added an odd layer to the theological debate about what it meant. The Hunnic Empire under Attila in the 440s ravaged both the Eastern and Western empires, and may have killed more people and destroyed more property than anything since the 3rd century crisis. Attila penetrated into Gaul in 451, where he was defeated at the Battle of the Catalonian Plains by a Roman Visigothic coalition led by the Roman general Aetius, the last great Roman general, known as the Last of the Romans, in one of the last significant military victories the Western Empire achieved. Attila died suddenly in 453, and the Hunnic Empire dissolved almost immediately, but the damage it had done to the Western Empire's structure was severe. In the following decades, the Western emperors became increasingly figurehead rulers, real power held by Germanic military commanders who used them as puppets, or discarded them when convenient. Aetius himself was murdered by the Emperor Valentinian III in 454, and Valentinian was murdered the following year by Aetius's men, and the Western Empire spent its last 2 decades cycling through emperors who ruled for months before being deposed. When Odoacer deposed Romulus Augustulus in 476, he was doing what had been done to a dozen emperors before him. He simply chose not to install a replacement. Why did the Western Empire fall and the Eastern survive? This question has been answered in hundreds of different ways by hundreds of historians since Gibbon first systematically addressed it in the 18th century. Economic explanations emphasize the greater wealth and productivity of the East. Military explanations note the greater defensive advantages of Constantinople's position. Political explanations observe that the East had better emperors for more of this critical period. Cultural explanations, Gibbon's own, which has been endlessly debated ever since, suggested that Christianity softened Roman martial virtue. Ecological explanations point to climate change and plague. Modern complexity theorists speak of cascading systemic failures. The honest answer is probably all of these simultaneously, interacting with each other in ways that no single explanatory framework captures adequately. The Western Empire fell because it was running under multiple simultaneous stresses, fiscal, military, demographic, ecological, that individually might have been manageable and collectively were not, and because the political institutions that might have managed them were themselves weakened by the stresses. and because the Germanic peoples on the frontier were themselves being pushed by pressures from further east, and because the particular decisions made by particular people at particular moments, as is always the case in history, mattered in ways that no purely structural analysis can capture. It did not fall all at once. It did not happen overnight. And the Romans who lived through it did not all know they were watching the fall of an empire. Some of them noticed that things were getting worse. Some of them adapted. Some of them kept writing poetry and letters and legal commentaries. A bishop in Gaul named Sidonius Apollinaris wrote letters to his friends in the last decades of the Western Empire that described dinner parties, hunting trips, the quality of a poem, the pleasure of the countryside. The world was ending and he was reviewing someone's verse. That is actually very Roman. What Rome left behind, the legacy that never ended. The Western Empire fell. The Eastern survived as Byzantium until 1453. Rome itself, the city, continued under different rulers, different religions, different languages, but continuous, inhabited, never abandoned. The Bishop of Rome became in many ways the heir to Roman institutional authority in the West, a continuity of office that stretches without break from the early church to the present day. But the legacy of Rome is not primarily about institutional continuity. It's about how thoroughly Rome rewired the world it touched, and how completely those changes persisted after the political structure that created them had dissolved. Start with language. Latin evolved into the Romance languages: Italian, French, Spanish, Portuguese, Romanian. These are not Latin with some changes. They are Latin, transformed by time and isolation, recognizably descended from the same parent. More than half the words in English, a Germanic language, derive from Latin either directly or through French. The entire vocabulary of law, medicine, science, philosophy, and government in European languages is primarily Latin in origin. Every time a doctor writes a prescription, every time a lawyer cites a precedent, every time a scientist names a new species, they are using the language of Rome, including, for that matter, the word prescription, and the word precedent, and the word species, the calendar. Julius Caesar reformed it in 46 before the Common Era, introducing the 365-day year with a leap day every 4 years. Slightly adjusted into the Gregorian calendar in 1582, it is the calendar the world uses today. January for Janus, March for Mars, July for Julius Caesar, August for Augustus. Every time you check the date, you are using a system Caesar's astronomers designed. He has been dead for over 2,000 years and is still organizing your schedule. Law. Roman law is the foundation of legal systems across continental Europe, Latin America, and large portions of Africa and Asia. The distinction between public and private law, the concept of legal personality, the structure of contracts, the presumption of innocence, these come from Roman legal thinking codified under the Emperor Justinian in the 6th century and transmitted through medieval universities. Even common law systems like Britain and the United States, which do not derive directly from Roman law, are shaped by categories that entered the Western tradition through Rome. Architecture. The arch, the vault, the dome, perfected by Roman engineers, became the defining vocabulary of Western building for 1,500 years. The Gothic cathedrals are structural refinements on Roman principles. The Dome of St. Peter's was explicitly inspired by the Pantheon. The United States Capitol has a dome. The Supreme Court has columns. The Lincoln Memorial looks like a Roman temple. Western institutional architecture has been speaking Roman for so long that we no longer hear the accent. Government. The idea of the Republic, of government as public trust rather than private possession, of laws above rulers, of citizens with rights, is a Roman idea. The United States Senate is named after the Roman Senate. The word constitution comes from Latin. The word republic comes from res publica, the public thing. Every modern democratic state working within constitutionalism and the rule of law is operating, however distantly, in a tradition that Rome shaped. The Roman legacy also includes things less comfortable to acknowledge: slavery, conquest, the engineering of empire for the benefit of a ruling class at the expense of everyone outside it. The grandeur we admire was built on enormous human suffering. The roads were built partly by enslaved labour. The aqueducts were financed by tribute extracted from conquered peoples. The Colosseum was built with the proceeds of the Jewish war. Rome was magnificent and Rome was terrible, often simultaneously, often inextricably. Both things are true and neither cancels the other, but the legacy persists regardless of how we assess it morally, because it is not separable from what came after. We cannot unlearn Roman law. We cannot unspeak the Romance languages. We cannot unbuild the cities that grew on Roman foundations. What we can do, what we should do, is understand Rome in its full complexity, its genius and its cruelty, its extraordinary productivity and its human cost. Rome is not past, it is infrastructure. We live inside it without always noticing what holds the walls up. It began with mud huts on 7 hills above a river. It became an empire touching 3 continents. It fell, gradually and under enormous pressure, and then it did not stop. It became the church, the medieval kingdoms, the Renaissance, the modern world. The thread never broke, it only changed colour. Romulus, who may not have existed, killed his brother to found a city that shaped the world you live in. History is not always tidy. Sometimes it begins with a murder by a river and ends with the calendar on your wall and half the words in your mouth. That is Rome. That is what it left. And it is still here. Now let the centuries settle. Let the roar of the legions fade to a whisper, and the whisper into silence. The roads are still out there in the dark, running straight and true, pointing back toward Rome. You do not need to follow them tonight. Rest now. History will still be here in the morning, and so, as always, will Rome.